There are stories that comfort us, tales that make us smile, legends that inspire courage in our hearts. But long ago, in the frozen north, where the aurora danced across endless winter skies, the Norse people told a different kind of story. They spoke of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the one myth that even the immortals themselves feared. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and darkness settles softly around you, we will journey together through the complete tale of this ancient prophecy, from the very beginning of time to the end of all things, and perhaps to what lies beyond. Let yourself relax. Let your breathing slow and deepen, for this is a story meant to carry you gently into sleep, through vast cosmic landscapes and the dreams of gods who knew their own doom was written in the stars. We begin our journey not in the world as we know it, not in any realm that bears trees or mountains or flowing rivers, but in a time before time itself had meaning, in a place that was not truly a place at all. The ancient Norse called it Ginnungagap, and the name itself seems to echo with emptiness, a word that sounds like wind through a chasm that has no bottom, no walls, no end. Ginnungagap was the great void, the yawning abyss that existed before creation drew its first breath, a space of absolute nothingness that stretched in all directions without limit or definition. If you could have stood within that void, though there was no ground upon which to stand, you would have perceived neither light nor darkness, for both require something against which to measure themselves, and here there was nothing at all. Yet Ginnungagap was not entirely without boundary, for to its north and south, if such directions could be said to exist in a place without reference, there lay two primordial realms that had somehow come into being from the void itself, two opposites that define the very nature of existence through their eternal opposition. To the south burned Muspelheim, the realm of fire, a world of such intense and terrible heat that even the gods who would later walk among the stars dared not venture too close to its blazing heart. Imagine a landscape where rivers flow not with water, but with molten stone that glows white and orange and deepest red, where the very air shimmers and dances with waves of heat that could unmake anything that possessed form or substance. Great tongues of flame leapt upward toward a sky that was itself composed of fire. And in this realm of eternal conflagration there dwelt beings born from the flames themselves, fire giants who knew nothing of cold or darkness or the gentle touch of cool water. The greatest and most terrible of these fire giants was Surtur, whose name meant black or swarthy, though he burned with a light so brilliant that to look upon him would sear the sight from mortal eyes. Surtur stood at the borders of Muspelheim, with a flaming sword in his hand, a weapon forged from the first fires that ever burned, and he waited there across ages that had not yet been measured, waited with the patience that only immortal beings can possess, for he knew that one day his purpose would be fulfilled, and he would march forth from his burning realm to set all of creation ablaze. The flames of Muspelheim reached out toward the void of Ginnungagap, sending waves of heat and showers of sparks spinning out into that nothingness. And where this heat traveled, it began to work a slow transformation upon the void itself. To the north, separated from Muspelheim by the vast expanse of Ginnungagap, there lay the opposite realm, a world as cold as Muspelheim was hot, as dark as Muspelheim was bright, as still as Muspelheim was violent with motion. This was Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist, and to speak its name is to feel the chill of winters that never end, to sense the weight of frost that accumulates over centuries without thaw. In Niflheim, great mountains of ice rose to unimaginable heights, their peaks lost in clouds of freezing fog that had hung motionless since before time began. Glaciers crept across landscapes that no eye had ever seen, their slow movement producing sounds like distant thunder as ice ground against ancient stone. Rivers of frozen mist wound through valleys carved by cold alone, and everything was gray and white and the deep blue of ice that has never known the sun. At the heart of Niflheim there existed a spring called Hidrgelmir, which meant the roaring cauldron, and from this spring flowed 11 rivers that the Norse people called the Elivagar, the ice waves. These rivers were not like the rivers you or I might know, flowing with clear water under summer skies. The Elivagar were composed of a substance that was neither quite water nor quite ice, a cold venom that hissed and steamed as it flowed outward from Hidrgelmir, traveling through the frozen wastes of Niflheim and eventually spilling out into the void of Ginnungagap. Layer upon layer of this frozen venom accumulated over ages, creating formations of rime and frost that extended like frozen fingers reaching out from Niflheim toward the empty center of existence. And so the universe existed in a state of tension, with heat from Muspelheim reaching northward into Ginnungagap, while cold from Niflheim extended southward. And in the center, in the very heart of the void, these two primordial forces were destined to meet. The warmth of Muspelheim's flames traveled through the emptiness, growing weaker as distance stretched between the fire realm and the void's center, but never entirely fading away. The cold of Niflheim's ice flowed southward, carrying with it the frozen venom of the Elivagar, creating vast sculptures of frost that hung suspended in nothingness. For ages beyond counting, these two forces approached one another, the gap between them narrowing so slowly that even immortal beings might not have perceived the change. Until at last, the frontier of heat and the frontier of cold touched one another in the centermost point of Ginnungagap. Where fire and ice met, something miraculous occurred, something that transformed absolute emptiness into the beginning of all things. The heat from Muspelheim struck the frozen venom from Niflheim, and the ice began to melt, sending up great clouds of steam that swirled and eddied in patterns that had never before existed in all of creation. The steam condensed and froze and melted again in an endless cycle. And from this churning chaos of transformation, from this meeting of absolute opposites, life stirred for the first time. Droplets of melting ice, touched by the warmth of distant flames, began to move with purpose, rather than merely flowing where forces pushed them. These droplets gathered together, combining and growing, taking on form and substance, until from the midst of the steam and ice and fire there emerged a being of enormous size and terrible power. This was Ymir, the first giant, the ancestor of all the giants who would later inhabit the realm of Jotunheim, and his birth from ice and fire made him a creature of contradiction and primal force. Ymir possessed a form roughly resembling that of a human, though he towered to heights that would later dwarf mountains, and his body was composed of the very frost and heat that had given him life. He was not beautiful, as the gods would later be beautiful, nor was he entirely monstrous, as some creatures of myth appear, but rather he embodied the raw, unrefined power of existence itself, life in its most basic and elemental form. Ymir's breath came in great rolling clouds that added to the mist swirling through Ginnungagap, and when he moved, which he did slowly and with the ponderous weight of a being made partially from ice, the sound was like glaciers calving or thunder rolling across frozen plains. But Ymir, enormous as he was, required sustenance, for even beings born from primordial forces must have nourishment to maintain their existence. And so the same forces that had created Ymir now brought forth another being from the melting ice, a creature entirely different in nature and purpose.
From the streams of melting venom ice, there emerged a cow of prodigious size, her coat white as fresh snow, her eyes dark and gentle despite her enormous proportions. The Norse people who later told these stories called her Audhumla, and she became the nourisher of Ymir, the second living being in all of existence. From Audhumla's udder flowed 4 rivers of milk, rich and pure and abundant beyond measure, and Ymir drank from these rivers and found sustenance that allowed him to grow even larger and more powerful as the ages passed.
Audhumla herself required nourishment, and she found it in a manner that would prove more significant than anyone could have imagined at that moment of creation's dawn. The great cow began to lick the salty ice blocks that had formed at the boundary between Niflheim's frost and Muspelheim's warmth. And as her enormous tongue passed over these blocks, the ice began to melt away in a manner quite different from the formless melting that had created Ymir. On the first day of Audhumla's licking, as evening came to a world that had never before known the distinction between day and night, there appeared in the ice the hair of a being, golden and fine like sunlight woven into strands. On the second day, as Audhumla continued her patient work, the head of this being emerged from the ice, a face of nobility and power, features carved as if by a master sculptor working in flesh rather than stone. On the third day, the entire body of the being was freed from the ice, and he stood forth as the first of a new kind of creature, different from both Ymir the giant and Audhumla the cow. This being was called Buri, and he was beautiful in a way that Ymir could never be, for while the giant embodied raw elemental power, Buri possessed something more refined, a quality that suggested thought and will and purposeful action rather than mere existence. Buri was strong and tall and fair to look upon, and though the tales do not tell us much of his life in those early ages, we know that he eventually had a son named Bor, and this lineage would prove to be the foundation upon which the gods themselves would be built. Bor, in his turn, took as his wife a giantess named Bestla, daughter of a giant named Bolthern. And this union between the line of Buri and the line of the giants would produce 3 sons whose actions would transform the universe from a place of formless chaos into a cosmos of order and meaning. But we move too quickly through these generations, for back in the earliest age, when Ymir and Audhumla and Buri were the only living beings in existence, other events were unfolding that would shape the nature of all that followed. As Ymir slept in those primordial times, warmed by the distant fires of Muspelheim and cooled by the ice of Niflheim, strange things occurred to his enormous body. From the sweat of his armpit, as he lay sleeping in the mists of Ginnungagap, there grew forth 2 beings, male and female, the first of the frost giants who would become his descendants. And from the friction of one of his legs against the other as he shifted in his sleep, there came forth a son with 6 heads, a monstrous being who would father further generations of giants. Thus, even in sleep, Ymir was creating others of his kind, populating the void with beings of immense power and uncertain temperament, creatures who embodied the chaotic forces from which they had emerged. Time passed in that strange world before the world, measured not in days or years, for such concepts did not yet exist, but in the slow accumulation of change, in the gradual growth of populations and power. The children of Buri's line multiplied, and the children of Ymir's sweat and friction multiplied. And while the tales do not speak of great conflicts in this earliest age, we can imagine that tensions began to grow between these 2 different kinds of beings, between those who carried the refinement of Buri and those who embodied the raw chaos of Ymir. The descendants of Buri valued order and purpose, while the frost giants who came from Ymir knew only the random violence of ice and storm. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine the very shape of existence, though none who lived in those days could have known how total the transformation would be. Among the descendants of Buri, there came at last 3 brothers who possessed power greater than any who had come before them. Three beings who would look upon the chaos of Ginnungagap and the growing multitude of frost giants and decide that change was needed, that order must be imposed upon chaos, that from the raw materials of the primordial world they would craft something new and purposeful. These three brothers bore names that would echo through all the ages that followed, names that would be spoken with reverence and fear and hope by countless generations of humans who did not yet exist. The eldest of the brothers was called Odin, and he would become known as the Allfather, the god of wisdom and war, poetry and magic, the one-eyed wanderer who would sacrifice much to gain knowledge of what was and what must be. The second brother was named Vili, whose name meant will, and he embodied the determination and purpose that would be needed to transform chaos into cosmos. The third brother was called Ve, which meant holy, and he brought the sacred quality that would elevate their creation above mere mechanical order into something worthy of reverence and wonder. These three brothers, Odin and Vili and Ve, looked upon the world of ice and fire and mist, looked upon the multitudes of frost giants who descended from Ymir, and they understood that no true cosmos could be built while Ymir lived, for the first giant was too powerful, too chaotic, too intimately connected to the formless forces of the primordial age. And so the three brothers made a decision that would reverberate through all of time, a choice that would make them simultaneously creators and destroyers, givers of life and dealers of death. They resolved to kill Ymir, to slay the being from whose body the frost giants had emerged, and from his remains to build the ordered cosmos that they envisioned. The battle between the three brothers and Ymir is not described in detail in the ancient tales, for perhaps some things are too terrible or too sacred to be spoken of fully, or perhaps the Norse people who preserved these stories understood that the outcome mattered more than the means. What we do know is that Odin and Vili and Ve succeeded in their purpose, that they slew the enormous giant whose body had existed since the first melting of ice in Ginnungagap's center. When Ymir fell, when the life departed from that immense form, something extraordinary happened that would determine the fate of nearly all the frost giants who had descended from him. From Ymir's wounds there flowed not merely blood, but a flood of such tremendous volume that it drowned almost the entire race of frost giants, a deluge that swept away the beings of chaos in a crimson tide that rolled through the frozen reaches where they dwelt. Only two giants managed to escape this catastrophic flood, a giant named Bergelmir and his wife, and these two fled in a vessel that the tales call a luther, which might have been a boat or a hollowed tree trunk, or perhaps something else entirely, and from these two survivors would eventually descend a new race of giants who would establish themselves in a realm called Jotunheim. But that story belongs to a later time. For now we must turn our attention to what the three brothers did with the body of the slain giant, for it was from Ymir's remains that they would fashion the entire cosmos, transforming the primordial chaos into an ordered universe of multiple realms and infinite possibilities. The three brothers took hold of Ymir's enormous corpse and dragged it to the center of Ginnungagap, to the very place where ice and fire had first met and where existence had begun. Here they began the great work of creation, systematically transforming each part of the giant's body into the elements and features of the world. From Ymir's flesh, still warm despite the giant's death, they formed the earth itself, the soil and stone and clay that would provide foundation for mountains and fields, forests and plains. The flesh became dirt that could sustain life, rich and fertile and dark, capable of bearing grass and trees and all the growing things that would later carpet the surface of the world. Where the flesh had been dense and heavy, it became deep bedrock that would support the mountains, and where it had been softer, it became the loam that would nourish crops and wild plants alike. From Ymir's blood and the fluid that had flowed from his body during his slaying, the three brothers created all the waters of the world, the seas and lakes and rivers that would flow across the land they were forming. This blood became the great oceans that would surround the lands, vast expanses of salt water that rolled with waves and tides, harboring within their depths creatures strange and marvelous. It became the lakes that would nestle in valleys between mountains, their surfaces reflecting sky and cloud, providing homes for fish and drinking water for beasts. It became the rivers that would carve paths through the landscape, flowing from high places to low, their currents carrying life and sustenance to all the regions through which they passed. The waters encircled the land in a great ring, creating boundaries between the world the brothers were forming and the chaos that still existed beyond its borders. From Ymir's bones, those massive structural elements that had supported the giant's immense frame, the three brothers fashioned mountains and cliffs and all the rocky features that would give the world its varied terrain. These bones became peaks that reached toward the sky, snow-capped summits that would scrape the clouds, mountains so tall that their tops existed in regions of eternal winter, even when valleys far below bloomed with summer warmth. They became the rocky cliffs that dropped sheer to the sea, providing nesting places for seabirds and standing as monuments to the world's creation. The larger bones became entire mountain ranges that marched across continents in chains of stone and snow, while the smaller bones became individual boulders and rocky outcroppings scattered across the landscape like the bones of the earth showing through its flesh. From Ymir's teeth and the fragments of bones that had been broken during his life or during the battle that ended it, the three brothers created rocks and stones and pebbles, the smaller elements of stone that would be found everywhere throughout the world. These became the gravel that would line riverbanks, the stones that would form beaches where waves rolled endlessly against the shore, the rocks that would push up through fields to challenge farmers who sought to till the soil. Each tooth became a boulder, each bone fragment a stone, each splinter a pebble, distributing the substance of the primordial giant throughout the world they were creating. From Ymir's skull, vast and arched like a dome, the three brothers created the sky itself, the great inverted bowl that would arch over the world and hold the heavens in place. They lifted the skull high above the earth they had formed from the giant's flesh, positioning it carefully to create space for air and clouds, for the flight of birds and the movement of weather. To hold the sky in place, to prevent it from falling back down upon the earth, the brothers positioned 4 dwarves at the cardinal points, one at the north, one at the south, one at the east, and one at the west. These dwarves were called Norðri and Sudri, Austri and Vestri, names that meant simply north, south, east, and west, and upon their shoulders rested the weight of the entire sky, a burden they would bear throughout all the ages that would follow.
From Ymir's brains, that soft matter that had once held whatever thoughts a primordial giant might think, the three brothers created the clouds that would drift across the sky they had formed. They took this substance and scattered it upward, transforming it into the white and gray masses that would float above the earth, sometimes thin and wispy, sometimes heavy with rain or snow, constantly changing shape as winds pushed them from place to place. These clouds would provide shade from the sun that the brothers had not yet created, would bring moisture to lands that might otherwise become desert, would make the sky something dynamic and alive, rather than a static dome of unchanging blue. But the brothers were not finished with their great work, for they had transformed the body of Ymir into earth and sea, mountains and sky, yet their creations still lacked light and warmth, still existed in a twilight state illuminated only by the distant glow of Muspelheim's fires. And so Odin and Vili and Ve reached out to that realm of flame, reaching carefully to gather sparks from its borders without venturing too close to its deadly heart, and these sparks they placed throughout the sky they had created. Some of these sparks they fixed in place, embedding them in the dome of the sky to become the stars that would shine throughout the night, patterns of light that future peoples would study and name and use to navigate across the trackless oceans. Other sparks they set in motion, giving them paths to follow across the sky. And these became the sun and moon that would provide greater light and mark the passage of time through their eternal journeys. The sun they placed in a chariot of gold that shone with its own radiance even beyond the fire it carried, and they appointed a maiden named Sol to drive this chariot across the sky each day, bringing light and warmth to the world below. Behind the sun's chariot they set a wolf named Skoll, who would chase Sol and her burden throughout eternity, snapping at the heels of her horses, forever pursuing but never quite catching the source of the world's light. The moon they likewise placed in a chariot of silver, and they appointed a youth named Mani to guide this lesser light through the night sky, waxing and waning in a cycle that would mark the passing of months and seasons. Behind the moon they placed another wolf called Hati, brother to Skoll, and this wolf too would chase his prey across the heavens throughout all time, his pursuit giving urgency to the moon's swift passage. The brothers then turned their attention to the earth they had created, this world formed from Ymir's flesh and bounded by seas made from his blood. They saw that it would need protection from the giants who had survived the great flood, from Bergelmir and his wife and the descendants they would produce. For these giants still embodied the chaos of the primordial age and might seek to unmake the order the brothers had imposed. And so from Ymir's eyebrows, those thick growths that had hung over the giants' eyes, Odin and Vili and Ve created a great wall, a fortification that would encircle the central region of the earth and protect it from the threats that might come from the outer regions. This wall marked the boundary of a new realm, a place of order carved from chaos. And this realm they called Midgard, which meant the middle enclosure or the Middle Earth, for it sat between the realm of the gods that they planned to create and the wild lands beyond, where giants and other dangerous beings would dwell. Having created Midgard and fortified it against external threats, the three brothers decided that their cosmos needed inhabitants beyond themselves and the surviving giants, beings who would live in this central realm and benefit from the order the brothers had created. But what manner of beings should these be? The brothers walked along the seashore of this new world, contemplating this question as waves rolled against beaches of sand and stone. And there they found 2 trees that had been cast up by the tide, pieces of driftwood worn smooth by salt water and time. One of these pieces came from an ash tree, the other from an elm. And as the brothers looked upon these pieces of wood, inspiration came to them. Odin approached the piece of ash wood and breathed into it the breath of life, the vital force that would animate dead matter and transform it into a living being. Vili touched the wood and gave it consciousness and understanding, the ability to think and feel and perceive the world around it. They blessed the wood with form and countenance, shaping it into a figure that could walk upright, that possessed hands to grasp and work, eyes to see and ears to hear. And there before them stood the first man, crafted from ash wood and given the name Askr, which simply meant ash. The brothers then performed the same creation with the elm wood, and from this second piece of driftwood emerged the first woman, whom they called Embla, and though the meaning of her name has been lost to time, she stood beside Askr as his companion and equal, the mother of all humans who would follow. Odin gave to these first humans breath and spirit. Vili gave them wit and movement. They gave them speech and hearing and sight. The brothers then provided Askr and Embla with clothing to protect their bodies from cold and heat. And they led these first humans into Midgard, showing them the world that had been prepared for them, teaching them how to survive and thrive in this land of fields and forests, mountains and streams. From this first couple would descend all the human race, all the countless generations who would spread across Midgard, building villages and towns and cities, planting crops and tending herds, telling stories and singing songs, living out their lives into the sun that Sol drove across the sky, and beneath the stars that the brothers had fixed in the heavens. But the brothers were not finished with their work of creation, for Midgard was only one realm among many that would compose the cosmos they were building. Above the world of humans, they fashioned another realm, a place of splendor and power that would serve as their own dwelling, a citadel from which they would watch over the worlds they had created and defend the order they had imposed upon chaos. This realm they called Asgard, which meant enclosure of the gods, and they built it high above Midgard in the branches of an enormous tree that had either existed since before time began or that grew from the work of creation itself. This tree was called Yggdrasil, and it was unlike any other tree that would ever grow, for it served as the axis of the entire cosmos, the central pillar around which all the realms were arranged, its roots reaching down into the deepest places of existence, while its branches stretched upward into regions beyond mortal comprehension. Yggdrasil was an ash tree of such tremendous size that its dimensions defied understanding, its trunk so vast that a man could walk for days and never circle its circumference, its roots so deep that they penetrated into 3 separate wells in 3 separate realms, drawing sustenance and wisdom from each. The tree's bark was gray and furrowed, like the bark of ancient ash trees everywhere. But it possessed a quality of permanence that no mortal tree could claim, for Yggdrasil would endure through all the ages of the world, through the rise and fall of gods and giants, through the coming of the end itself, standing as the one constant in a universe of change and transformation. Its branches spread in all directions, creating spaces between them where entire realms could exist, and its leaves rustled with a sound like distant voices, speaking prophecies that none could quite make out. At the crown of Yggdrasil, in the topmost branches that reached toward the vault of the sky, there perched an eagle whose vision was so keen that it could observe events occurring in any of the realms, and between this eagle's eyes sat a hawk who could see even further and with greater clarity than the eagle itself. At the roots of the great tree, gnawing constantly at its substance, there dwelt a dragon called Nidhogg, whose name meant striker in the dark, or malice striker, and this creature worked ceaselessly to damage the tree, chewing at its roots in an eternal attempt to bring about its fall. Running up and down the trunk of Yggdrasil, between the eagle at the top and the dragon at the bottom, there scurried a squirrel named Ratatosk, which meant drill-tooth, and this creature carried insults between the eagle and the dragon, keeping alive an ancient feud between the being of the heights and the being of the depths, ensuring that discord existed even in the structure of the cosmic tree itself. 3 great roots supported Yggdrasil and drew sustenance from 3 sacred wells located in different realms. The first root extended into Asgard itself, and beneath this root lay the well of Urd, tended by 3 beings of tremendous power and mysterious nature called the Norns. These Norns were named Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, which meant fate, becoming, and that which should be, and they represented the past, present, and future that governed all existence. The Norns would sit beside their well each day and draw water from its depths to pour upon the roots of Yggdrasil, preserving the tree's health and ensuring its continued existence, for even a cosmic tree required care and attention. But the Norns did more than tend the tree, for they wove the fates of all beings, gods and giants, humans and elves, spinning threads that determined the course of each life from birth to death, weaving patterns that none could alter once the threads were set in place. The second root of Yggdrasil extended into Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, and beneath this root lay the well of Mimir, which contained waters of wisdom and knowledge beyond measure. This well was guarded by a being called Mimir, whose name meant the Rememberer or the Wise One, and he had drunk from the well's waters and thereby gained understanding of all things past and insight into much that would come to pass. The water of Mimir's well was so precious, so filled with knowledge and understanding, that even Odin himself would one day sacrifice his eye to drink from it, paying a terrible price to gain the wisdom he believed he needed to prepare for the doom that awaited him and all the gods. The third root of Yggdrasil extended down into Niflheim, that ancient realm of ice and mist that had existed since before creation began, and beneath this root lay Havelgamir, the roaring cauldron from which the 11 rivers called Elevaga had originally flowed. This well was the source of all waters, the primordial spring from which existence itself had emerged when its frozen venom had melted in the heat from Muspelheim, and here dwelt Nidhogg the dragon, along with countless serpents who helped the great worm in his work of gnawing at the tree's roots. The waters of Havelgamir held a different kind of power than those of Urd's well or Mimir's well, for they connected directly to the primordial chaos from which everything had emerged, and they served as a reminder that beneath order and creation there always existed the possibility of dissolution and return to the formless state. Around and within Yggdrasil, the brothers and other powers arranged 9 realms, 9 worlds that would each serve a different purpose and house different kinds of beings. Asgard at the top was the realm of the gods, the place where Odin and his brothers and the other deities who would join them would build their halls and establish their rule. Midgard, as we have seen, was the realm of humans, positioned in the middle of the cosmos and protected by the wall made from Ymir's eyebrows.
Jotunheim was the realm of the giants, a wild and mountainous land of dark forests and stone peaks where winter never fully released its grip, where the descendants of Bergelmir would establish themselves and maintain their ancient opposition to the gods and all they represented. Alfheim was the realm of the elves, beings of light and beauty who possessed magical abilities and served as allies to the gods in most matters, though they kept largely to themselves in their own lands of eternal summer and gentle twilight. Svartalfheim, which some called Nidavellir, was the realm of the dwarves, located beneath the mountains in networks of caverns and halls carved from living stone, and here dwelt the master craftsmen who would forge many of the magical items that gods and heroes would wield, beings who had first emerged from the maggots that had fed upon Ymir's flesh, but who had been given intelligence and form by the gods. Vanaheim was the realm of another group of gods, called the Vanir, deities associated with fertility and prosperity, with the growing of crops and the increase of herds, and though the Vanir would eventually come into conflict with Odin and the gods of Asgard, they would also make peace and exchange hostages, binding their two groups together through oaths and shared interest. Helheim was the realm of the dead, a cold and misty place located beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, where those who died of sickness or old age rather than in glorious battle would go to spend their afterlife in the company of countless other shades, neither happy nor tormented, but simply existing in a state of grey twilight under the rule of a being we shall meet later in our story. Niflheim remained as one of the 9 realms, that ancient place of ice and mist that had existed since before creation, now incorporated into the ordered cosmos, but retaining its primordial character, a reminder of what had existed before the brothers began their work. And Muspelheim, too, remained among the 9 realms, that world of fire where Surtur still stood with his flaming sword, waiting with inexhaustible patience for the day when he would be released to fulfill his purpose. To connect Asgard with Midgard, to provide a way for the gods to descend from their high realm to walk among humans when they wished, the gods constructed a bridge of shimmering light that arched across the space between the 2 worlds. This bridge was called Bifrost, which meant shimmering path or trembling roadway, and it appeared to those who could see it as a rainbow stretching from earth to sky, its colors bright and pure, its structure somehow both solid enough to walk upon and insubstantial as light itself. At the Asgard end of Bifrost, the gods placed a guardian whose task would be to watch for any threats approaching the realm of the gods, any giants or other enemies who might attempt to use the bridge to assault Asgard. This guardian was called Heimdall, and he possessed senses so acute that he could hear grass growing in Midgard and see for hundreds of miles in any direction, and he needed less sleep than a bird, making him the perfect watchman for the gods' realm. In Asgard, each of the major gods would eventually build a hall suited to their nature and function, creating a realm of magnificent structures that gleamed with gold and precious metals, that rang with song and laughter and the clash of weapons in practice combat.
Odin's hall was called Valhalla, which meant Hall of the Slain, and here the All-Father would gather warriors who had died bravely in battle, chosen by his warrior maidens called Valkyries, who flew over battlefields selecting the worthy fallen. These warriors, called Einja, or lone fighters, would feast each night in Valhalla and fight each day in practice for a great battle that would one day come, when they would be needed to defend Asgard against its enemies. The hall had 540 doors, and through each door could march 800 warriors abreast, and its rafters were made of spears, while its roof was shingled with shields, and an eagle flew above it, and a wolf prowled before its gates. Thor, the strongest of the gods, built a hall called Bilskirnir in a region of Asgard called Trudheim, which meant place of might, and this hall had more rooms than any other building in all the realms, 640 rooms to be precise, for Thor's generosity and hospitality meant that any who needed shelter could find it in his home. Freya, the goddess of love and beauty, battle and magic, had a hall called Sesrumnir in a field called Falkfang, and to her hall came half of those who died in battle, for she shared the privilege of choosing the slain with Odin, taking her pick of the warriors before the Valkyries made their selections. Each god had their own dwelling, their own space within Asgard, where they could pursue their particular interests and exercise their specific powers, and together these halls created a realm of splendor and might that stood as a monument to the order the gods had imposed upon chaos. And so the cosmos was complete. The 9 realms arranged around and within Yggdrasil, each connected to the others through the world tree's roots and branches, each inhabited by its appropriate beings, all held together in an ordered structure that transformed the formless void of Ginnungagap into a universe of meaning and purpose. The sun rose in the east and set in the west, chased by Skull across the sky. The moon followed its own path through the night, pursued by Herti through the darkness. The seasons turned in their proper order as the earth journeyed around the sun. Humans lived their lives in Midgard, farming and fishing, loving and fighting, building and creating. The gods watched over the worlds from their halls in Asgard, occasionally descending to Midgard to interact with humans or traveling to other realms to pursue their various aims. This was the Age of Gold, a time when everything seemed bright and new, when the gods were young and strong and confident in their power, when the order they had created seemed eternal and unshakable. The gods would gather in council to discuss matters of importance, meeting at the Well of Erd beneath Yggdrasil's first root, and there they would make decisions about the governance of the cosmos and the fate of various beings who came to their attention. They created the dwarves to be master craftsmen, giving them life and intelligence and setting them in the mountains and beneath the earth to work their wonders with metal and stone. They established laws and customs, oaths and agreements, creating the social structures that would govern interactions between gods and between gods and other beings. But even in this golden age, even in this time of glory and creation, there existed shadows that hinted at future troubles, tensions that could not be entirely resolved, prophecies that spoke of doom to come. The giants who dwelt in Jotunheim had not forgotten that Odin and his brothers had slain Ymir and drowned nearly all the giant race in the flood of the first giant's blood. They nursed their grievances across generations, raising their children on stories of the injustice done to them, preparing themselves for a day when they might take revenge upon the gods who had built their ordered cosmos from the body of the giant's ancestor. The gods knew this, knew that beyond the borders of their ordered realms there existed beings who opposed them, who represented chaos and disorder,
who would seek opportunities to undermine or destroy what the gods had built. Among the gods themselves, there walked one who embodied contradiction and complication, one whose nature made him simultaneously helper and hindrance, friend and foe, creative problem solver and destructive troublemaker. This was Loki, and his presence in Asgard was itself a kind of prophecy, a sign that even among the gods there existed forces that could not be entirely controlled or predicted. Loki's origins were complex, for though he lived among the gods and called Odin his blood brother, having mixed his blood with the All-Father in a ritual of brotherhood, he was not truly of the gods' race. His father was a giant named Farbaudi, which meant cruel striker, and his mother was called Laufey, or nail, which meant leafy island or needle. And from this parentage, Loki inherited a nature that was neither fully god nor fully giant, but something between, something that could move between the ordered world of Asgard and the chaotic realm of Jotunheim with equal ease. Loki was handsome and clever, possessed of a quick wit and a silver tongue that could talk his way out of almost any situation, and his ability to shapeshift into various forms, to become a bird or a fish, a woman or a horse, made him uniquely useful to the gods when situations required cunning rather than straightforward strength. He helped the gods out of difficult predicaments on many occasions, using his clever schemes to outwit giants or recover stolen property, and for this reason the gods valued him despite their unease about his nature. But Loki also had a malicious streak, a tendency toward mischief that sometimes shaded into genuine malevolence, and he had been known to create problems for the gods as often as he solved them. He seemed to take pleasure in causing trouble, in stirring up conflict, in seeing others brought low by schemes and tricks, and this aspect of his nature made the other gods wary of him even as they appreciated his talents. Loki had several wives and consorts over the years, and from these unions came children who would play crucial roles in the events that would lead to the end of the Golden Age and the coming of Ragnarok. With his proper wife Sigyn, a goddess of loyalty and devotion, Loki had 2 sons named Nafi and Vali, and these children were as innocent as their father was complicated, caught up in events not of their making. But with another consort, a giantess from Jotunheim named Angrboda, whose name meant bringer of grief, or she who offers sorrow, Loki fathered 3 children who would be anything but innocent, 3 offspring who would embody threat and chaos in forms so terrible that even the gods would struggle to contain them. The first of these 3 children was Fenrir, and he took the form of a wolf, though to call him merely a wolf would be to inadequately describe his nature and his power. Fenrir was born normal in size, or at least not impossibly large, but from his earliest days it was clear that he possessed an appetite that could never be satisfied, and a capacity for growth that knew no natural limit. As a puppy, he was already larger than normal wolves, and he grew with each passing day, his size increasing so rapidly that those who saw him on consecutive days could observe the difference with their own eyes. The gods, learning of this wolf child of Loki growing in Jotunheim, became concerned about what he might become if allowed to reach his full size. And so they brought him to Asgard, where they could watch him and, they hoped, contain him. In Asgard, Fenrir continued to grow, and his appetite grew along with his size until none of the gods dared approach him to feed him except Tyr, the god of war and justice, who had the courage to place meat before the wolf's jaws, despite the risk that those jaws might snap shut upon the hand that fed them.
Day by day, week by week, Fenrir grew larger, until he was the size of a bear, then larger still, until he was the size of a small house, and still he continued growing with no sign that he would ever reach a natural limit to his size. The gods gathered in council to discuss what should be done about this wolf who grew too large and too quickly, and they remembered the prophecies that the Norns had spoken, prophecies that said Fenrir would one day break free and bring great destruction upon the gods themselves. The gods decided that Fenrir must be bound, must be restrained before he grew so large that no chain could hold him, and so they approached the wolf with what they claimed was a test of his strength, a game to see if he was strong enough to break free from fetters. They brought forth a chain of tremendous strength called lading, links of iron forged by dwarven smiths to be stronger than any normal chain, and they proposed to Fenrir that he allow himself to be bound with this chain to demonstrate his might. Fenrir, who was still young enough to be curious and eager to prove himself, agreed to this proposal, and the gods wrapped lading around him and secured it tightly. The wolf then flexed his muscles, kicked his legs, and the chain shattered as if it were made of dry grass rather than forged iron, and Fenrir was free again, apparently pleased with this demonstration of his strength. The gods, hiding their alarm behind smiles and congratulations, withdrew to forge another chain, one even stronger than the first, and this chain they called Dromi, and it was made with twice the strength of lading, its links thicker and its metal harder. Again they approached Fenrir, praising him for breaking the first chain and challenging him to try his strength against this even stronger fetter. Again Fenrir agreed, allowing the gods to bind him with Dromi, wrapping the chain around him multiple times and securing it with elaborate knots. The wolf gathered his strength, tensed his enormous muscles, and then burst free from Dromi with slightly more effort than he had needed to break lading, sending fragments of chain scattering across Asgard like shrapnel, nearly injuring several gods who stood too close. Now the gods were truly alarmed, for they had used their two strongest chains, and Fenrir had broken both with relative ease, and the wolf continued to grow larger with each passing day, his strength increasing proportionally with his size. If they could not bind him with chains forged by the gods themselves, how could they hope to contain him when he reached his full growth? Odin sent a messenger to Svartalfheim, to the halls of the dwarves who dwelt beneath the mountains.
The dwarves labored long over this commission, and what they created was something paradoxical, something that seemed weak but possessed strength beyond measure. They called it Gleipnir, and it appeared to be nothing more than a simple ribbon, smooth and soft as silk, light enough that a child could have carried it without effort. But Gleipnir had been woven from 6 ingredients that did not exist in any normal sense, from the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird, all things that were impossible or nearly so, and this combination of impossibilities gave the ribbon a strength that no amount of iron or steel could match. When the gods received Gleipnir from the dwarves, they brought it before Fenrir with another proposal, another challenge to test his strength against this new fetter. But Fenrir had grown wise to their attempts to bind him, and when he saw the soft ribbon they carried, he grew suspicious. This looked nothing like the great chains that had been used before, and its very harmlessness suggested trickery of some kind. Fenrir told the gods that he would not allow himself to be bound with Gleipnir unless one of them would place their hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith, a guarantee that they truly meant this as a test of strength and not as an attempt to imprison him permanently. The gods looked at one another, and no one wanted to volunteer their hand to Fenrir's jaws, for all knew that if the wolf could not break free from Gleipnir, he would surely bite down and sever the hand that had been offered as surety. But Tyr, the god who had fed Fenrir all this time, the god who represented justice and the keeping of oaths, stepped forward and placed his right hand, his sword hand, into the wolf's mouth, resting it upon Fenrir's lower jaw while the great fangs closed gently above it. With this pledge given, Fenrir allowed the gods to wrap Gleipnir around him, binding his legs and body with the soft ribbon that seemed so harmless yet carried such hidden power. Fenrir began to struggle against Gleipnir, flexing his muscles as he had done before, gathering his strength to shatter this ribbon as he had shattered the chains. But this time, something different occurred. The more Fenrir struggled, the tighter Gleipnir became, the ribbon constricting around him with each movement, growing harder and more unyielding the more force he applied against it. The wolf thrashed and twisted, kicked and pulled, using all his enormous strength in an attempt to break free, but Gleipnir only grew tighter and tighter, binding him more securely with each passing moment. Finally, Fenrir understood that he had been tricked, that this was not a test but a prison, and that the gods had no intention of releasing him.
In his rage and betrayal, the wolf bit down upon Tyr's hand, severing it cleanly at the wrist, and the god of justice stepped back, cradling his bleeding stump, while the other gods quickly secured Gleipnir more thoroughly, binding the wolf so that he could not move at all. The gods took Fenrir far from Asgard, dragging him across the landscape while he struggled against Gleipnir's unbreakable bonds, and they brought him to a remote and desolate place where none would hear his howls of rage and frustration. There they drove a sword through his jaws, the point fixing itself into the roof of his mouth while the hilt pressed against his lower jaw, forcing his mouth to remain open in an eternal snarl. From Fenrir's open jaws there flowed a river of drool and foam, his saliva creating a stream that the Norse people called Von, and this river would flow throughout all the ages until the day when the wolf would finally break free. The gods left Fenrir there in his bonds, knowing that they had only delayed his threat rather than eliminating it, for the prophecies had said that he would one day break free, and when that day came, the wolf would remember this betrayal and seek terrible vengeance upon those who had bound him. The second child of Loki and Angbordha was called Jormungandr, and where Fenrir had taken the form of a wolf, this offspring took the shape of a serpent, a snake whose capacity for growth would prove even more remarkable than his brothers. When the gods learned of this serpent child living in Jotunheim, they brought him too to Asgard to examine him and determine what threat he might pose. Jormungandr was small when the gods first saw him, no larger than a normal snake, but they could sense the potential for growth within him, the same endless appetite for expansion that had characterized Fenrir. Odin himself took hold of the serpent and made a decision that he believed would neutralize the threat while avoiding the kind of binding that had been necessary with the wolf. The Allfather carried Jormungandr to the edge of Asgard and hurled the serpent down from the realm of the gods, casting him into the great ocean that surrounded Midgard, the sea that had been made from Ymir's blood and that encircled the land where humans lived. Odin believed that in the depths of the ocean the serpent would be contained by the water itself, unable to threaten the gods or the order they had created. But Jormungandr thrived in the cold waters of the world sea, and he began to grow just as Fenrir had grown, his body lengthening day by day, his coils extending through the depths of the ocean. He grew and grew, becoming larger than any whale, larger than any ship, larger than any island, until his body had become so long that he encircled the entire world, his tail eventually meeting his own head as he completed the circuit around Midgard.
Jormungandr took his own tail into his mouth, biting down gently upon it to complete the circle, and in this position he would remain throughout the ages, dwelling in the deepest parts of the ocean, occasionally rising toward the surface to hunt for food, or simply to move restlessly in his eternal confinement. The serpent's movements would cause storms and whirlpools on the surface of the sea, his stirring creating waves that could sink ships and flood coastlines, and sailors who ventured far from land would sometimes catch glimpses of his enormous coils breaking the surface before disappearing again into the depths. The gods knew that Jormungandr posed a constant threat, that his very existence disturbed the order of the cosmos, But they also knew that as long as he remained in the ocean with his tail in his mouth, he was at least partially contained. The prophecies said that when Jormungandr released his tail, when he pulled his head away from his own hindquarters, that would be a sign that Ragnarok was beginning, that the end of the age had arrived. The third child of Loki and Angrboda was a daughter, and she bore the name Hel, which would become synonymous with the realm of the dead over which she would eventually rule. Hel's appearance was unlike anything the gods had seen before, for she embodied death and decay in her very flesh. From the waist up, she appeared as a beautiful young woman, her skin pale but healthy, her features fair and her hair dark and lustrous. But from the waist down, her body was that of a corpse in an advanced state of decomposition, her flesh greenish-black and mottled, falling from her bones in places, giving off the smell of death and the grave. She walked with a strange gait, half living and half dead, her upper body moving with the grace of youth, while her lower body dragged and shuffled with the stiffness of the deceased. When Odin beheld Hel, he understood that she was not entirely a threat in the way her brothers were threats, but neither could she be allowed to dwell in Asgard among the gods, for her very presence was a reminder of mortality and death, concepts that the gods preferred not to contemplate too closely, despite knowing that even they were not truly immortal. The Allfather made a decision regarding Hel that would prove to be both practical and deeply significant for the cosmos he and his brothers had created. He took the death goddess and cast her down into Niflheim, that ancient realm of ice and mist that existed beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, and there he gave her authority over 9 worlds, granting her dominion over all those who died of sickness or old age, all those who did not fall in battle and therefore could not go to Valhalla or Folkvangr. In Niflheim, Hel established her own realm, a kingdom of the dead that came to bear her name, Helheim, and she built herself a hall called Eljudnir, which meant misery or sprayed with snowstorms. The hall stood behind high walls and gates that were difficult to pass, and the path leading to it was long and treacherous, dropping steadily downward into cold and darkness. Those who died without honor in battle would find their way to Hel's hall after death, their spirits descending through the earth to this realm of shadows and mist. And there they would remain until the end of the world, neither punished nor rewarded, but simply existing in a state of gray half-life. Hel ruled over these dead with a fairness that was neither kind nor cruel, providing them with food and drink that satisfied without nourishing, with accommodations that sheltered without comforting, treating all her subjects with the same impartial coldness that death itself displays toward all who fall under its dominion. The gods congratulated themselves on having dealt with Loki's 3 monstrous children, having bound Fenrir with Gleipnir, cast Jormungandr into the ocean, and sent Hel to rule over the dead in Niflheim. They believed they had neutralized these threats, or at least delayed them sufficiently that they need not worry about them in the immediate future. But the prophecies that the Norns spoke when asked about these matters were not comforting, for the 3 sisters who wove fate said that these children of Loki would one day break free from their bonds or rise from their appointed places, and when they did, they would bring about the destruction of the gods and the end of the Golden Age. The gods heard these prophecies and understood that their time was limited, that the cosmos they had created from Ymir's body would not endure forever, but they chose to enjoy their glory while it lasted and to prepare as best they could for the doom that awaited them. The Golden Age continued in Asgard, though now with an undercurrent of awareness about the future that cast a shadow over even the brightest celebrations. The gods held their councils and judged disputes, traveled to other realms on various errands, and generally maintained the order they had established. Among all the gods, there was one who seemed to embody everything that the Golden Age represented, one whose very presence brought joy and light to all who encountered him. This was Balder, the son of Odin and his wife Frigg, and he was called the Beautiful, the Shining One, the god whose glory outshone all others save perhaps his father's. Balder's beauty was not merely physical, though he was fair to look upon with his golden hair and clear eyes, his strong form and graceful movements. His beauty came from within, from a soul that was pure and good, from a nature that was kind and just, from a heart that sought always to help others and to bring peace where there was conflict. He lived in a hall called Breidablik, which meant broad gleaming or wide shining. And this hall was so pure that nothing evil or unclean could exist within its walls. No harsh word could be spoken there. No unjust thought could be conceived within its bounds. Balder was married to a goddess named Nanna, and together they had a son called Forseti, who would become the god of justice and reconciliation, inheriting his father's fairness and his ability to see the good in all beings. Despite his perfection and purity, or perhaps because of it, Balder began to be troubled by dreams as he grew older, visions that came to him in sleep and haunted him when he woke. These were not pleasant dreams of past glories or future triumphs, but dark visions filled with shadows and omens of death, dreams in which he saw himself falling, felt himself growing cold, sensed an ending approaching that he could not understand or prevent. Night after night these dreams came to Balder, and though he tried to dismiss them as meaningless phantoms of sleep, they persisted with such force and clarity that he finally spoke of them to his mother Frigg, admitting that he feared they might be prophecies rather than simple nightmares. Frigg was filled with dread when she heard her son's words, for a mother knows her child's heart, and she could tell that Balder's fear was genuine and justified. She went to Odin and told him of Balder's dreams, and the All-Father's face grew grim, for he too had been having troubling visions, glimpses of a future in which darkness overcame light, in which the Golden Age came to an end. Odin decided that he must know more about what these dreams portended, and so he saddled Sleipnir, his 8-legged horse who was himself one of Loki's children, born when the trickster had taken the form of a mare and been impregnated by a giant's stallion. Sleipnir could travel faster than any other horse, could ride through the air and over the sea, could even descend into the realm of the dead, and it was to this last place that Odin now directed him. Down and down they rode, Odin and Sleipnir, descending through the earth along the paths that led to Helheim, passing through regions of increasing cold and darkness, until they came at last to the Hall of Hel herself. There Odin did not seek to speak with Hel, for he knew she would tell him nothing, but instead he used his magic to raise the spirit of a Volva, a seeress who had died long ago and whose knowledge of fate and prophecy had been considerable when she lived. The Volva's spirit came reluctantly from its rest, summoned by Odin's powerful magic, and she spoke to the All-Father with a voice that seemed to come from a great distance, echoing strangely in the cold air of Helheim. Odin asked the Volva about Balder's dreams, about what fate awaited the shining god, and the seeress's answer was terrible to hear. She spoke of a death that was coming, of a god falling despite being loved by all, of a loss that would mark the beginning of the end. She told Odin that preparations had already been made in Helheim for Balder's arrival, that a seat of honor had been prepared for him, that mead had been brewed and a place set at Hel's table for this god who would soon join the ranks of the dead. The Volva spoke of other things as well, of events that would follow Balder's death, of a chain of consequences that would lead inexorably toward Ragnarok itself, but Odin had heard enough. He released the spirit from his compulsion and rode Sleipnir back up to the world of light, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his beloved son was doomed. When Odin returned to Asgard and told Frigg what he had learned, the goddess refused to accept that Balder's fate was sealed. If death threatened her son, then she would do everything in her power to protect him from that threat. Frigg left Asgard immediately and began a journey that would take her through all the 9 realms, traveling tirelessly from world to world, seeking out every being and every object that existed in the cosmos. To each thing she met, Whether it was alive or inanimate, whether it possessed consciousness or was merely matter, she asked the same request, demanded the same oath. She made everything in existence swear an oath not to harm Balder, not to cause him injury or bring about his death. And such was the love that all beings bore for the shining god that none refused her request. Frigg traveled to each realm in turn, speaking to gods and giants, elves and dwarves, humans and animals. She spoke to stones and asked them to promise not to strike Balder. She spoke to metals and made them swear not to cut or pierce him. She spoke to plants and trees and made them vow not to wound him with thorn or branch. She spoke to diseases and poisons and extracted oaths that they would not afflict him. She spoke to fire and water, to earth and air, to every element and every force, and all agreed to spare Balder from harm. She was thorough in her quest, visiting every corner of existence, speaking to everything that might possibly pose a threat to her son. And only when she had received oaths from all things did she finally return to Asgard, satisfied that Balder was now safe from the death that had been prophesied. The gods were amazed when they learned what Frigg had accomplished, and they devised a way to test whether the oaths she had extracted were truly effective. They gathered in an open field in Asgard and had Balder stand in the center while they took turns throwing objects at him, striking at him with weapons, testing whether anything could harm the shining god. Stones were thrown at Balder and they veered away before striking him. Arrows were shot toward him and they turned aside. Axes were swung at his head and they bounced off without leaving a mark. Swords were thrust at his chest and they could not penetrate his skin. It seemed that Frigg's efforts had succeeded completely, that her son was now invulnerable to all harm, and the gods laughed with delight at this discovery, making a game of hurling increasingly large objects at Balder and watching them fail to hurt him in any way. But one god did not join in the laughter and celebration. Loki watched the proceedings with growing annoyance and resentment, for where others saw cause for joy, he saw only that Balder was receiving attention and praise, that the shining god was once again the center of everyone's focus, the object of everyone's love. Loki had always harbored a kind of jealousy toward Balder, for while the trickster was clever and occasionally useful, he was never loved the way Balder was loved, never trusted the way Balder was trusted, never seen as purely good the way everyone saw the beautiful god as embodying goodness itself. And so Loki began to scheme, wondering if there might be a way to harm Balder despite all the oaths that Frigg had collected, searching for a weakness in the protection that the goddess had so carefully constructed. Loki disguised himself as an old woman, bent and frail in appearance, and in this form he made his way to Frigg's hall Fensalir, where the goddess had returned after ensuring her son's safety. He found Frigg resting from her labors, content in the knowledge that Balder was protected, and he struck up a conversation with her, complimenting her on her devotion to her son and asking about the oaths she had collected. Frigg, seeing only a harmless old woman, spoke freely about her journey through the 9 realms, about how she had made everything swear not to harm Balder, about how thorough she had been in her quest. The old woman listened carefully and then asked with seeming innocence whether Frigg had truly received oaths from everything in existence, whether there was anything at all that had not sworn to spare Balder. Frigg smiled at the question and admitted that there was one thing she had not bothered to extract an oath from, for it seemed so small and weak and insignificant that it could not possibly pose any threat. To the west of Valhalla, she told the old woman, there grew a plant called mistletoe, a parasitic growth that clung to the branches of oak trees, and she had not asked this plant to swear an oath because it seemed too young and too feeble to cause harm to anyone, much less to a god as strong as Balder. The old woman thanked Frigg for the conversation and departed, and as soon as she was out of sight of Fensalir, Loki shed his disguise and hurried westward toward Valhalla, seeking the mistletoe that Frigg had mentioned. He found the plant growing just where Frigg had said it would be, pale and green,
its berries white and waxy, clinging to an oak branch and drawing its sustenance from the larger tree.
Loki carefully cut a branch of the mistletoe, choosing a piece that was long and straight, and he worked on this branch as he walked back toward where the gods were still playing their game with Balder. He sharpened one end of the mistletoe branch into a point, hardening the wood with magic until it was as firm as any spear, and by the time he returned to the field where the gods were gathered, he held in his hand a weapon that was the only thing in all of existence capable of harming the shining god. Loki approached the edge of the gathering and noticed that one god stood apart from the others, not participating in the game of throwing objects at Balder. This was Hother, Balder's blind brother, a god who stood in his brother's shadow despite being a skilled warrior and a worthy deity in his own right. Hother could not join the game because he could not see where Balder stood, could not aim his throws or time his movements to participate in the celebration. Loki sidled up to Hother and spoke to him with false friendliness, asking why he was not honoring his brother by joining in the game. Hother explained that his blindness prevented him from participating, that he had no weapon to throw and could not see where to throw it even if he had one. Loki offered to help, suggesting that he would guide Hother's aim and even provide him with a weapon to throw, a small branch that would certainly bounce off Balder harmlessly like everything else. He placed the sharpened mistletoe branch in Hother's hand, positioned the blind god's arm, and directed him to throw toward where Balder stood in the center of the field, still laughing and smiling as the other gods pelted him with objects that could not hurt him. Hother, grateful for the opportunity to honor his brother, drew back his arm and threw the mistletoe branch with all his strength toward where Loki had directed him to aim. The mistletoe flew straight and true, guided by Loki's directions and propelled by Hother's strength, and it struck Balder in the chest, penetrating his flesh where no other weapon had been able to pierce, driving deep into his heart. The shining god gasped and staggered, his eyes wide with surprise, and then he fell to the ground, already dead before his body completed its collapse. For a moment, absolute silence descended upon the field, the gods frozen in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Then Frigg's scream of anguish shattered the silence, and the gods rushed forward to where Balder lay motionless on the ground, his golden hair spread around his head like a halo, his eyes already glazing over with the film of death. The gods stood around Balder's body in shock and grief, unable to believe that the shining god, who had been invulnerable just moments before, now lay dead at their feet. They looked at Hother, who stood with his blind eyes turned toward the sound of their grief, confused and horrified as he began to understand what he had done.
They looked at Loki, who had already begun to edge away from the gathering, sensing that the mood was turning dangerous. Frigg wept inconsolably, and Odin's face was grim with the knowledge that the prophecy had been fulfilled, that this death marked the beginning of the end, that Ragnarok had taken its first step toward inevitability.
The gods lifted Balder's body with reverent care, carrying him from the field where he had fallen to the seashore where his ship Hringhorni was moored, for they would give him a funeral befitting the greatest and most beloved of all their kind. Hringhorni was the largest ship ever built, its hull broad and sturdy, its mast tall enough to touch the clouds, and the gods adorned it with treasures and weapons, with cloths of gold and silver, preparing it to serve as Balder's funeral pyre and his vessel for the journey to Helheim. They laid Balder's body upon the ship's deck, arranging him so that he looked as if he were merely sleeping rather than dead, and they prepared to launch the ship and set it ablaze so that Balder's spirit could begin its descent to the realm of the dead. But when the time came to push Hringhorni into the water, the gods discovered that the ship was too heavy for them to move, its weight and size defeating even their divine strength. They pushed and strained, but the ship would not budge from where it rested on the shore, and the gods realized they would need help to accomplish this final service for Balder. They sent word to Jotunheim, to the realm of the giants, asking for the assistance of a giantess named Hraken, who was known for her tremendous strength. Hraken came riding into Asgard on a wolf, using poisonous serpents as reins, and her appearance was so fearsome that Odin had to order 4 berserkers to hold her mount steady while she dismounted, and even these 4 warriors in their battle fury could barely control the wolf. Hraken approached Hringhorni and placed her hands upon the ship's stern, and with a single mighty push she sent the vessel sliding down into the water with such force that the wooden rollers beneath it burst into flame from the friction, and the earth itself shook from the impact. Thor was angered by this display of strength from a giantess, feeling that it somehow diminished the solemnity of the occasion, and he raised his hammer Mjolnir as if to strike Hraken down, but the other gods restrained him, reminding him that the giantess had come at their request and had done them a service. Hraken departed without incident, and the gods returned their attention to completing Baldur's funeral. As the gods stood on the shore preparing to set fire to the ship, Baldur's wife Nanna came forward to look one last time upon her husband's face, and the sight of him lying dead upon the ship's deck was more than her heart could bear. The goddess collapsed, dying of grief in that very moment, and the gods, respecting the depth of her love for Baldur, placed her body upon the ship beside her husband so that they could make the journey to Helheim together. Odin approached the ship and leaned down to whisper something in Baldur's ear, words that none of the other gods could hear, a message from father to son that would remain a mystery.
Some said he was telling Baldur the secrets he had learned from the Volva in Helheim, sharing knowledge of what would come to pass in the future. Others said he was making a promise to his son about revenge or resurrection. But Odin never revealed what he had said, and Baldur carried those words with him into death. Among the treasures placed aboard Hringhorni was Odin's golden ring Daupnir, which had the magical property of producing 8 new gold rings of equal weight every 9 nights, a gift that would provide Baldur with wealth in the afterlife. Thor walked around the ship and consecrated the pyre with his hammer Mjolnir, sanctifying this funeral with the power of thunder. A dwarf named Lit ran in front of Thor as he was performing the ceremony, getting in the god's way, and Thor, in his grief and anger, kicked the dwarf into the fire that had just been lit aboard the ship, sending Lit to accompany Baldur to the realm of death. Many gods and goddesses attended this funeral, and even giants came from Jotunheim to witness it. For Baldur had been beloved even by those who were enemies to the gods, his goodness transcending the ancient enmity between the two races. As Hringhorni burned, the flames rising high into the sky, the smoke visible from all of Asgard and even from distant Midgard, where humans looked up and wondered what great fire had been lit in the realm of the gods, Frigg turned to those assembled and asked if anyone would volunteer to undertake a journey to Helheim, to go into the realm of the dead and plead with Hel herself to release Baldur and allow him to return to the living. She promised that whoever undertook this quest would earn her love and favor forever, but it was a dangerous journey she was asking for, one that would require riding through dark and treacherous paths, crossing bridges guarded by terrible beings, entering a realm from which few living beings had ever returned. Hermod, one of Odin's sons, stepped forward and volunteered to make this journey, for he was known as Hermod the Brave and possessed the courage necessary for such a quest. Odin provided him with Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse who could travel anywhere in the 9 realms, and Hermod mounted the steed and set off immediately, riding down from Asgard toward the paths that led to Helheim. For 9 days and 9 nights, Hermod rode through valleys that grew progressively darker and colder, following roads that descended steadily into the earth, passing through regions where no light penetrated and the air grew thick with the scent of ice and decay. He came at last to the river Djol, which marked the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead, a river that ran with the sound of weapons clashing rather than the normal sounds of flowing water. A bridge called Jarlbru spanned the river Djol, and this bridge was guarded by a maiden named Modgudur,
whose task was to question all who sought to cross into Helheim.
Modgud challenged Hermod, asking his name and his lineage, and she expressed surprise that he was a living being seeking to enter the land of the dead, for the bridge had shaken more beneath the hooves of his single horse than it had the previous day when 5 companies of the dead had crossed it to enter Hel's realm. Hermod explained his quest, and Modgud directed him to continue downward and northward along the road that led to Hel's gates, wishing him luck in his endeavor. Hermod rode on until he came to the gates of Helheim itself, tall barriers that stood closed and forbidding before him. But Sleipnir was a magical horse, capable of feats that no normal steed could accomplish, and Hermod spurred him forward, and the 8-legged horse leaped over the gates of Helheim as if they were merely a small obstacle, rather than the boundary between death and life. They came to the hall Eljudnir, and Hermod dismounted and entered the hall to find Balder and Nonna sitting at the high table beside Hel herself, the beautiful shining god looking pale and diminished in this realm of shadows, his wife sitting quietly beside him with an expression of infinite sadness. Hermod remained in Helheim overnight, and in the morning he approached Hel and made his request, begging the ruler of the dead to release Balder and allow him to return to Asgard, explaining how much the shining god was loved and how deeply his death had grieved both gods and men. Hel listened to Hermod's plea with her characteristic impassivity, her living half showing no expression, her dead half showing even less, and when he had finished speaking, she made a proposal. If it was true that Balder was as beloved as Hermod claimed, then proving it should be simple enough. She would release Balder from her realm on one condition, that every single thing in all of existence weep for him. If all beings and all objects would shed tears for Balder, demonstrating that his loss was truly mourned by everything in creation, then she would let him go. But if even one thing refused to weep, then Balder would remain in Helheim until after Ragnarok, when the world would be reborn and he could return to life in that new age. Hermod agreed to these terms, for surely, after Frigg's efforts to make everything promise not to harm Balder, it would be easy enough to convince everything to weep for him now that he was dead. Before Hermod departed, Balder gave him the ring Draupnir to return to Odin, a sign that he had truly been to Helheim and spoken with the dead god, and Nonna sent gifts for Frigg as well, a linen robe and other treasures. Hermod rode back out of Helheim, crossing the river Joel once more, ascending through the dark valleys until he reached Asgard and reported what Hel had said. The gods immediately set about fulfilling Hel's condition, sending messengers throughout all the 9 realms to ask everything in existence to weep for Balder.
The messengers traveled far and wide, speaking to every being they encountered, and everywhere they went they found willing ears. Gods wept for Balder and giants wept for him. Humans wept and elves wept. Animals wept, shedding tears from eyes that usually showed no such emotion. Plants wept in their own fashion, releasing moisture that dripped from their leaves like tears. Stones wept, growing wet with condensation as if grief had moved even their inanimate substance. Metals wept, showing rust and oxidation as their form of sorrow. It seemed that everything in all of creation mourned the loss of the beautiful god, that Hel's condition would be met and Balder would be released. But as the messengers were returning to Asgard, satisfied that their task had been completed successfully, they encountered one final being whom they had not yet asked to weep. In a cave far from any settlement, in a remote and desolate place, they found a giantess sitting alone in the darkness. She was called Thok, and when the messengers explained their mission and asked her to weep for Balder, the giantess refused. In a harsh voice, she declared that Balder had never done anything for her, that she had no tears to shed for the dead god, and that Hel should keep what she had.
The messengers pleaded with Thok, explaining that if she alone refused to weep, Balder would be lost forever. But the giantess was unmoved by their arguments. She spoke no other words after her refusal, simply turning her face away and sitting in stubborn silence until the messengers finally gave up and departed. The messengers returned to Asgard with the devastating news that one being had refused to weep, that Hel's condition had not been met, that Balder would remain in the realm of the dead. The gods were overcome with despair at this news, but that despair quickly turned to suspicion and then to certainty as they considered who Thok might have truly been. They became convinced that the giantess was Loki in disguise, that the trickster who had engineered Balder's death with the mistletoe had now ensured that the shining god could not be rescued from Helheim. Their grief transformed into rage, and they set out to find Loki and punish him for what he had done, for the double crime of causing Balder's death and preventing his resurrection. But Odin, sitting on his high throne Hlidskjalf, from which he could see all that occurred in the 9 realms, spotted Loki despite his disguises and transformations, and the Allfather led the other gods to the place where the trickster was hiding. Loki, seeing the gods approaching from all 4 directions at once, quickly transformed into the salmon and leapt into the waterfall, diving deep into the pool at its base. But the gods had anticipated this, and they brought with them a net that Loki himself had invented, for they had found in his house the ashes of the fire where he had burned a prototype of this fishing tool. Thor took one end of the net, and another god took the other end, and they dragged it through the pool, searching for the salmon that was Loki. The trickster dove deeper, trying to hide beneath stones at the bottom of the pool, but the gods added weights to the net, dragging it along the bottom and leaving no place for the salmon to hide. Finally, Loki had no choice but to leap over the net, attempting to escape back up the waterfall. But Thor was waiting for this, and he reached out with his quick hands and caught the salmon in mid-leap. The salmon squirmed and twisted in Thor's grip, trying desperately to escape, and its tail was so slippery that it kept sliding through the thunder god's fingers, which is why salmon to this day have tails that are narrow and tapered, shaped by Thor's grip in that ancient moment. But Thor managed to hold on long enough for the other gods to surround them, and they forced Loki to resume his true form and dragged him to a cave far beneath the earth where they would imprison him until the end of the world. In this cave, the gods placed 3 large stone slabs on edge, drilling holes through each slab, and they bound Loki across these stones with fetters that would not break, just as they had bound his son Fenrir with Gleipnir. But the gods were not content merely to bind Loki, for they wanted him to suffer as they had suffered when Balder died. They brought Loki's 2 sons, Narfi and Vali, innocent children who had done nothing to deserve punishment, and through cruel magic they transformed Vali into a wolf. The wolf, driven by instincts it could not control, immediately attacked its brother Narfi and tore him to pieces while Loki watched in horror, unable to help his son or prevent the murder. The gods then took Narfi's entrails and used them to bind Loki to the stone slabs, the father bound with the intestines of his murdered son, and through more magic, they transformed these entrails into iron chains that Loki could not break. Above Loki's face, the gods placed a venomous serpent, positioning it so that poison dripped continuously from its fangs onto the bound trickster's face. The venom burned wherever it touched his skin, causing agony that made Loki writhe and scream, his struggles shaking the earth itself and creating what humans would come to call earthquakes. But Loki's wife Sigyn, who had been loyal to him despite all his crimes and betrayals, remained with him in the cave. She sat beside him holding a bowl to catch the serpent's venom before it could drip onto his face, providing him with relief from the burning poison. But periodically the bowl would fill, and Sigyn would have to turn away to empty it, and during those moments the venom would drip onto Loki's face unchecked, and his screams and struggles would be so violent that the entire earth would shake. There Loki would remain, bound beneath the earth with his loyal wife sitting beside him, suffering the consequences of his actions against Balder, waiting for the day when his bonds would break and he would be free to take his revenge upon the gods who had punished him so severely. The prophecies said that this day would come, that Loki would break free when Ragnarok began, that he would lead armies against Asgard in the final battle, that his hatred for the gods who had bound him would fuel his desire to see their world destroyed. For now he was contained, his threat neutralized, just as his children's threats had been neutralized through binding and banishment. But the seeds of the gods' destruction had been planted, and Balder's death had marked the moment when those seeds began to grow toward their terrible fruition. The Golden Age had ended with Balder's death, though the gods tried to continue their lives as before, tried to maintain the order and joy that had characterized their earlier existence. But the light had gone out of Asgard with the loss of the shining god, and a shadow hung over even the brightest celebrations, a sense that something fundamental had changed, that the cosmos had shifted in a subtle but irreversible way. The gods continued to hold their councils at the Well of Ord, continued to judge disputes and maintain order throughout the 9 realms, but there was a heaviness to their deliberations now, an awareness of mortality and endings that had not been present before. Odin became more obsessed with gathering knowledge and preparing for the doom that he knew was coming. He had always been a seeker of wisdom, but now his quest took on an urgency that bordered on desperation. He spent more time consulting the Norns, trying to extract from them every detail about what would occur during Ragnarok. He traveled to distant corners of the 9 realms, seeking prophets and seers who might tell him something useful, some piece of information that might allow him to change, or at least prepare for the fate that awaited him in the other gods. He gathered warriors to Valhalla with renewed vigor, selecting the finest fighters from among the human dead, training them endlessly for the battle that would come at the end of time.
The Einherjar, these chosen warriors of Valhalla, spent their days in combat practice, fighting mock battles on the fields outside Odin's hall, and though they killed each other in these fights, they would rise again each evening, whole and uninjured, ready to feast on the meat of the boar Seremnir, who was slaughtered each day and restored each night. The Valkyries, Odin's warrior maidens who chose the slain from battlefields in Midgard, worked constantly to recruit new fighters for this army that was preparing for Ragnarok. Every god understood that when the final battle came, they would need all the help they could muster, for the prophecies made it clear that the forces arrayed against them would be overwhelming. Thor continued his eternal opposition to the giants, making frequent journeys to Jotunheim to battle the enemies of the gods. But even his great strength and the power of his hammer Mjolnir could not eliminate the giant threat entirely. The giants continued to multiply, bearing grudges against the gods for ancient wrongs, plotting constantly to undermine the order that Odin and his brothers had created from Ymir's body. There were skirmishes and battles, moments of tension and conflict, but nothing that rose to the level of all-out war, for both sides understood that such a war would come only at the appointed time, when Ragnarok finally began. In Midgard, humans lived their lives largely unaware of the cosmic tensions building in the realms above and around them. They farmed their fields and fished their waters, built their settlements and raised their children, told stories of the gods and made offerings at sacred sites, hoping for good harvests and victory in battle, for fair weather and healthy livestock. Sometimes the gods would descend to Midgard and interact with humans, taking mortal lovers and fathering heroes who would perform great deeds, teaching skills and crafts, intervening in human affairs in ways both helpful and harmful. The humans who lived during this time did not know that their world existed in the shadow of prophecies about its destruction, that everything they built and created was temporary, that Ragnarok would one day sweep it all away. Time passed, measured in human generations and in the longer cycles by which gods measured their existence. The sun continued its daily journey across the sky, chased by Skoll, who never quite caught it. The moon waxed and waned through its monthly cycle, pursued by Hot Tea through the darkness. The seasons turned in their proper order, winter following autumn, spring following winter, summer following spring.
Yggdrasil stood at the center of all things, its roots reaching into the three wells, its branches holding up the realms, its trunk serving as the axis around which the cosmos turned. The Norns continued their work of weaving fate, spinning threads and cutting them, determining the length and character of every let.
But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change in ways that suggested the Golden Age's time was drawing to a close. The gods noticed that winters seemed to last a bit longer than they once had, that summers were slightly cooler, that the brightness of the sun seemed diminished, though Sol still drove her chariot across the sky with the same dedication she had always shown. The wolves, Skull and Hati, who had chased the sun and moon since the beginning of time, seemed to be drawing closer to their prey, their jaws snapping nearer to the celestial bodies they pursued. Small signs and omens accumulated, events that individually seemed insignificant, but that collectively suggested a pattern, a progression towards something terrible. The gods consulted the Norns more frequently, asking when Ragnarok would begin, how they might recognize its approach, whether there was anything they could do to prevent or delay it. The three sisters who wove fate gave answers that were both specific and cryptic, describing signs that would herald the beginning of the end, while making it clear that nothing could prevent what had been ordained since the cosmos was created. They spoke of a great winter that would come, a winter unlike any that had been seen before, 3 winters that would follow one another with no summer between them, and this period they called Fimbulwinter, the mighty winter or the great winter, and it would mark the time when the world began its slide toward destruction. They spoke of moral collapse among humans, of a time when brother would turn against brother, when fathers would fight sons and mothers would abandon daughters, when the bonds that held society together would dissolve and all would be chaos and violence. They described how the wolves that chased the sun and moon would finally catch their prey, how the celestial lights would be swallowed and darkness would fall upon all the realms. They told of earthquakes and floods, of mountains crumbling and the world tree shaking, of bonds breaking and prisoners escaping, of ships sailing with crews of the dead, of armies marching from every corner of the cosmos to converge on a battlefield where the fate of existence would be decided. Odin listened to these prophecies with a grim expression, understanding that his own death was written into the events that would unfold, knowing that Fenrir would break free from Gleipnir and devour him, that the wolf he had helped to bind would be the instrument of his doom. Freyr learned that he would face Jormungandr in a final battle, that he would slay the world serpent, but would die from its venom moments after his victory. Freyr discovered that he would fall to Surtur's flaming sword, killed by the fire giant who had waited since before creation to fulfill his purpose. Heimdall learned that he and Loki would slay each other in combat, ancient enemies finally settling their differences in mutual destruction. Each god learned something of their fate, and while the knowledge was terrible, they accepted it with the courage that their culture valued, resolving to meet their doom with dignity and strength, rather than attempting futile resistance against destiny. The years continued to pass, and the signs became more pronounced, the omens more frequent. In Midgard, humans began to notice that their crops failed more often, that livestock sickened and died without apparent cause, that the weather grew more extreme and unpredictable. Conflicts between neighboring settlements became more common, old grudges that had been settled peacefully now erupting into violence, treaties and oaths being broken with increasing frequency. There was a sense among humans that something was wrong with the world, though they could not articulate exactly what had changed, a feeling that the order which had always governed their lives was somehow weakening, that chaos lurked just beyond the borders of civilization, waiting for an opportunity to rush in. And then, after centuries of these small warnings and minor disruptions, after generations of humans had lived and died under the shadow of approaching doom, Fimbulwinter began. It started subtly, with an autumn that seemed colder than usual,
frost coming earlier than expected, leaves falling from trees before they had fully changed their colors. The harvest that year was poor, and people stored what food they could, hoping that the winter would not be too severe. But as the days grew shorter and the cold deepened, it became clear that this would be no ordinary winter. Snow began to fall before the autumn had fully ended, and once it began, it did not stop. Day after day, snow fell from gray skies, accumulating in drifts that buried houses and blocked roads, making travel impossible and isolating communities from one another. The cold was unlike anything humans had experienced in living memory. A bitter cold that penetrated through the thickest furs and the warmest fires, that made breath freeze in the lungs and turned exposed flesh black with frostbite within moments. Lakes and rivers froze solid, their ice thick enough to support the weight of armies. The seas began to freeze at their edges, ice creeping outward from the shores, threatening to lock ships in place and close off the routes of maritime trade and travel. Animals that had always survived previous winters now perished in the extreme cold, their frozen bodies found beneath snowdrifts when the wind occasionally cleared a space. Birds that normally migrated south for winter could not survive the journey, falling from the sky like stones, their wings frozen, their tiny hearts stopped by cold that exceeded their capacity to endure.
They made sacrifices to the gods, slaughtering precious livestock and burning offerings, praying for the return of spring, for the warmth of the sun, for relief from the terrible cold that seemed to have no end. But spring did not come. The winter continued through the time when the snow should have been melting, through the season when farmers should have been planting their fields, through the warm months when children should have been playing outside beneath the summer sun. The days remained short and dark, the sun appearing only briefly above the horizon before sinking back down, and even when it was visible, its light seemed weak and pale, providing no warmth to the frozen world below. Starvation began to spread through human communities as food supplies ran out. Families that had carefully rationed their stores found themselves with nothing left to eat, and they faced choices that no one should have to make, decisions about who would receive the last scraps of food, whether to abandon the weak to save the strong, whether to resort to acts that would have been unthinkable in easier times. The social bonds that had always held communities together began to fray and then to snap. Neighbors turned on one another, fighting over the last resources. Blood feuds that had been settled generations ago erupted again as people looked for anyone to blame for their suffering. Villages that had been allies for centuries became enemies, raiding one another for food and fuel, killing to survive. Families collapsed under the pressure of the endless winter. Brothers who had loved each other since childhood fought over inheritance, each believing that they deserved the last of their parents' stores. Fathers abandoned their children when they could no longer feed them, and mothers did things that would haunt them forever, assuming they survived long enough to be haunted. The laws and customs that had governed human society, the oaths and agreements that had maintained order, became meaningless in the face of starvation and cold. Morality itself seemed to freeze along with the land, leaving only desperate survival, only the base instinct to continue living for one more day, regardless of what that required. This first winter finally began to recede, but not into spring. The snow stopped falling, and the temperatures moderated slightly, rising from impossible cold to merely severe cold, from deadly to merely miserable. But before anyone could plant crops or begin to recover from the devastation, before hope could take root in hearts that had been frozen along with the land, the second winter began. More snow, more cold, and this time there were even fewer resources to draw upon, even less food stored away, even less firewood to burn. The suffering of the first winter was multiplied in the second, and what little remained of human civilization continued to crumble away. By the time the third winter arrived, Most of humanity had perished. The survivors were scattered and isolated, huddled in whatever shelters they could find, burning furniture and then the structures themselves for warmth, eating anything that could possibly provide sustenance. These survivors had become unrecognizable as the people they had once been, reduced to shadows of humanity, to creatures driven only by the need to survive. The world had become a wasteland of ice and snow, a realm of white and grey where nothing grew and nothing could grow, where life itself seemed to be dying along with the light and warmth that had once sustained it. In Asgard, the gods watched Midgard's suffering with pity and growing dread, for they understood that what was happening to humans was only the beginning. The prophecies had said that Fimbulwinter would affect all the realms, and indeed the cold had penetrated even to Asgard itself, though the gods were less vulnerable to it than mortals. The halls of the gods became quieter, the feasts less joyous, as everyone felt the weight of what was coming. Odin sat on his throne and gazed out across the realms with his one good eye, seeing the devastation spreading everywhere, knowing that worse was yet to come, that Fimbulwinter was only the prelude to Ragnarok itself. Heimdall stood at his post at the Asgard end of Bifrost, watching with his keen sight for any signs of the enemies who would come when the final battle began. His horn Jalahorn hung beside him, the horn whose blast could be heard throughout all the 9 realms, the horn that he would sound when Ragnarok truly began. Day and night Heimdall watched, sleeping less than a bird, hearing sounds that no other being could perceive, seeing things at distances that no normal sight could achieve, waiting for the moment when he would need to alert the gods to prepare for the last battle. And then, on a day near the end of the 3rd winter, when the cold had reached its deepest point, and the darkness seemed absolute, Heimdall saw movement in the distance that made him grip his horn with both hands. The wolves Skoll and Hati, who had chased the sun and moon since time began, had finally caught their prey. Heimdall watched as Skoll's jaws closed around Sol's chariot, watched as the sun was devoured, its light extinguished in the wolf's gullet. He saw Hati pull down the moon, swallowing Mani and his silver chariot, plunging the night into absolute darkness. The stars that had shone since Odin and his brothers had placed them in the sky began to fall, winking out one by one, until the heavens were as dark as the depths of the ocean, until nothing remained of the lights that had guided travellers and marked the passage of time. The earth began to shake, tremors that started small but grew rapidly in intensity, earthquakes that were more severe than any that had occurred before. Mountains that had stood since the world was created from Ymir's bones began to crumble, their peaks collapsing, avalanches of stone and snow cascading down their slopes. The ground split open in places, creating chasms that swallowed entire forests, valleys that became suddenly deeper as the earth itself seemed to be tearing apart. Yggdrasil, the world tree that had stood at the center of all things since before the gods began their work of creation, began to tremble, its branches shaking, its leaves falling like rain, its trunk groaning as if it were about to split. In the frozen wastes where Fenrir had been bound with Gleipnir, the wolf felt the trembling of the earth and understood that his time had come. He gathered his strength, all the power that had been building within him during the long ages of his imprisonment, all the rage that had been accumulating since the day the gods had tricked him and bound him, and he pulled against the magical ribbon that had held him for so long. Gleipnir had been woven from impossible things, made strong through magic and dwarvish craft, but even magic had limits, and Fenrir's strength exceeded those limits now. The ribbon stretched and then snapped, its threads parting with a sound like thunder, and the wolf was free at last. Fenrir rose to his full height, no longer the size he had been when the gods had bound him, but impossibly larger, grown to proportions that defied reason during his long imprisonment. His jaws could have swallowed mountains, his teeth were like sharp peaks, his eyes burned with hatred for the gods who had betrayed him. The wolf threw back his head and howled, a sound that echoed across all the realms, a declaration that his captivity had ended and his revenge would now begin. He shook himself and began to move, his paws leaving craters in the earth with each step, heading toward Asgard to fulfill the prophecy that said he would devour Odin. In the ocean surrounding Midgard, Jormungandr felt the shaking of the earth transmitted through the water, and the world serpent released the tail that he had been biting for ages, pulled his head away from his hindquarters, and began to move. The serpent's stirring created waves that dwarfed anything the sea had produced before, tsunamis that rose hundreds of feet high and traveled across the ocean at impossible speeds. When these waves reached the shores of Midgard, they swept away what little remained of human civilization, drowning the survivors who had endured Fimbul winter, washing away settlements and farms, flooding valleys and plains. The ocean itself seemed to be rising as Jormungandr made his way toward the surface, his enormous coils displacing so much water that the sea level increased dramatically, submerging lands that had always been above water. The serpent's head broke the surface of the ocean, his eyes the size of lakes, his mouth capable of swallowing ships whole, his body so long that it disappeared into the distance in both directions, still encircling the world, even as he raised his head high above the waves. Jormungandr opened his mouth and hissed, a sound like steam escaping from 1,000 geysers, and from his mouth there came venom, poison that sprayed across the sky and began to rain down upon the earth and sea. This venom was deadly beyond measure, capable of killing anything it touched, and it began to poison the air itself, making the atmosphere toxic, turning the sky green with its corrupt influence. Jormungandr began to make his way toward land, pulling his enormous body behind him, creating more waves as he moved, heading toward the place where the final battle would occur. Beneath the earth, in the cave where Loki had been bound with the entrails of his murdered son, the trickster god felt the shaking and understood that Ragnarok had begun. The chains that had held him for so long suddenly weakened as the magic that had sustained them failed in the chaos of the world's ending, and Loki pulled against them, and they snapped. He pushed away the serpent that had been dripping venom on his face and stood up for the first time in ages, his body stiff from long imprisonment, his face scarred by the burns from the poison, his heart filled with hatred for the gods who had punished him so severely. Sigyn, who had sat beside him all those years holding the bowl to catch the venom, who had remained loyal when everyone else had abandoned him, took his hand as he emerged from the cave into the dying world. Loki looked around at the chaos spreading across the realms, at the darkness that had fallen with the devouring of the sun and moon, at the earthquakes tearing the world apart, at the floods spreading from the ocean as Jormungandr moved, and he smiled a grim smile. This destruction was what the gods deserved for what they had done to him and his children. He would lead the armies that would destroy Asgard, would fight alongside giants and monsters against those who had called themselves his friends before betraying him. Loki made his way to the shore where a ship was waiting. The strangest ship that had ever sailed, made entirely from the fingernails and toenails of dead men that had been collected over countless generations in preparation for this moment. This ship was called Naglfar, and it was enormous, capable of carrying vast armies across the sea, and its appearance was as disturbing as its composition suggested. The hull gleamed with an oily sheen, the nails that formed it still retaining something of the appearance they had possessed when they had been part of living bodies, and the sight of it inspired dread in any who beheld it. Loki climbed aboard Naglfar, taking his position at its helm, and the ship began to fill with the dead from Helheim, for Hel had opened the gates of her realm and allowed all those who had died without glory in battle to emerge and join the forces that would fight against the gods. These dead were pale and wraith-like, but they could still wield weapons and fight, and they came aboard Naglfar in numbers beyond counting, filling the ship from bow to stern. In Helheim, Hel herself prepared to join the battle, though she would not fight personally, but would simply observe the destruction of the world that had given her dominion over the dead. She had waited in her realm of mist and cold for this day, and now that it had arrived, she felt something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps merely the fulfillment of destiny that had been ordained since before she was born. Her brother Fenrir would fight, and her brother Jormungandr would fight, and her father Loki would lead armies, and together they would bring down the gods who had separated their family and scattered them across the realms. In Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, frost and stone giants gathered their weapons and prepared to march toward Asgard. They had been waiting for this day since Odin and his brothers had slain Ymir and created the cosmos from the first giant's body, and now their chance for revenge had finally arrived. The giants assembled in great hosts, thousands upon thousands of them, armed with clubs and axes, with bows and spears, ready to fight and die if necessary, to destroy the gods who had made themselves masters of creation. At their head was Hrym, a giant of immense size and strength, who would steer Nagfar alongside Loki, commanding the forces of chaos against the forces of Orber. In Muspelheim, the realm of eternal fire, Surtur rose from his throne where he had sat since before the world was made. The fire giant had waited longer than anyone, waited since the first meeting of ice and flame in Ginnungagap, and finally his purpose would be fulfilled. Surtur took up his sword, a blade made of living flame that burned brighter than the sun that had been devoured, a weapon that would set the world ablaze and return everything to the primordial chaos from which it had emerged. Around Surtur, other fire giants gathered, beings of flame and destruction who would follow him across the burning bridge to Asgard, and together they would fulfill the prophecy that said Muspelheim would destroy the realm of the gods. Surtur led his army toward Bifrost, toward the rainbow bridge that connected the realms, and the heat of the fire giant's approach caused the bridge itself to begin burning. The beautiful structure that had stood since the gods created it, that had allowed passage between Asgard and Midgard for ages beyond counting, began to crack and splinter under the heat and the weight of the fire giant army marching across it. Heimdall, standing at the Asgard end of the bridge, saw them coming and knew that the moment had arrived when he must sound the alarm.
The watchman of the gods raised Gjallarhorn to his lips and blew a single sustained blast that echoed across all the 9 realms, a sound so loud and clear that it woke even the dead in their graves, that penetrated to every corner of existence, announcing that Ragnarok had truly begun. In Valhalla, Odin heard Gjallarhorn's call and rose from his throne. The time he had been preparing for since Baldur's death, the doom that he had known was coming, had finally arrived. The Allfather donned his armor, golden and gleaming, and took up his spear Gungnir, which never missed its target when thrown. Around him the Einherjar prepared for battle, 800 warriors pouring from each of Valhalla's 540 doors, a vast army of the glorious dead ready to fight one last time in defense of Asgard and the order that the gods represented. These warriors were the greatest fighters who had ever lived, chosen by Odin's Valkyries from battlefields across the centuries, trained endlessly in preparation for this moment, and they marched forth from Valhalla with courage in their hearts, despite knowing that the prophecies promised their defeat. Thor strapped on his belt of strength, which doubled his already formidable power, and he took up Mjolnir, his hammer that could level mountains and had slain countless giants. The Thunder God knew that he would face Jormungandr in the coming battle, knew that the prophecy said he would slay the world serpent but die from its venom, and he accepted this fate as he had accepted every challenge that had come before.
Thor's sons, Modi and Magni, whose names meant courage and strength, prepared to fight beside their father, young gods who would survive Ragnarok, according to some prophecies, who would inherit their father's hammer after his death and carry it into the new world that would rise from the destruction. Freya, the god of fertility and summer, of growth and abundance, prepared for battle with a heavy heart, for he had given away his magical sword in exchange for winning the hand of the giantess Gerd, whom he had loved, and now he would face Surta in combat without the weapon that might have given him a chance of victory. Freya knew he would fall to the fire giant's flaming blade, but he armed himself with what weapons he could find and prepared to fight anyway. For courage in the face of certain death was the highest value of the culture that had created these gods and told their stories. Across Asgard, all the gods prepared for battle, arming themselves with their finest weapons, donning their strongest armor, gathering the courage necessary to face an enemy that outnumbered them and that destiny said would triumph over them. The armies assembled on the plain of Vigrid, a vast field that had been prophesied to be the site of the final battle, a space large enough to accommodate the thousands of combatants who would fight there. Vigrid stretched for 100 leagues in every direction, its surface flat and featureless, perfect for the clash of armies that was about to occur. On one side of the field stood the gods in the Einharjar, shining in their armor, ready to defend the order they had maintained since creation. On the other side stood the forces of chaos, Fenrir and Jormungandr, Loki leading the dead from Naglfar, the frost giants and stone giants from Jotunheim, Surtur and the fire giants from Muspelheim, all arrayed against the gods, all ready to destroy the cosmos and return existence to chaos. The two armies stood facing each other across the plain of Vigrid, and for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, there was silence. The gods looked upon their enemies, seeing the wolf whose jaws could swallow worlds, the serpent whose venom poisoned the very sky, the fire giant whose sword burned with flames that could unmake creation, and they knew that their defeat was written in the threads that the Norns had woven. But they did not flee, did not attempt to bargain or surrender, for that was not the way of the gods or the people who had imagined them. Instead, they raised their weapons and prepared to fight, to meet their doom with courage and dignity, to ensure that if this was truly the end, it would be an ending worthy of remembrance in whatever might come after. Odin stood at the front of the army of gods in Einharjar, his single eye surveying the enemies arrayed against him, and he saw Fenrir moving through the ranks of giants and dead, the wolf's massive form towering above everything else on the battlefield. The Allfather knew that this was his destined opponent, that the wolf he had helped to bind would be the one to end his life, and he accepted this with the wisdom that came from having drunk from Mimir's well and having hung upon Yggdrasil to learn the secrets of the runes. Odin raised Gungnir high, and the spear gleamed in the darkness that had fallen over the world with the devouring of the sun, and he gave the signal for the battle to begin. The armies rushed toward each other with a sound like mountains colliding, like oceans crashing against cliffs, like thunder rolling across endless plains. The Einharjar clashed with the dead from Naglfar, warrior spirits fighting warrior spirits, and though both groups had already died once before, they fought with the fury of the living, knowing that this battle would determine the ultimate fate of existence.
Swords rang against shields, axes bit into armor, spears pierced flesh that was neither fully alive nor fully dead, and the plain of Vigrid became a chaos of combat, bodies falling and rising only to fall again, the outcome uncertain despite what the prophecies had said. The gods fought their way through the enemy ranks, each seeking the opponent that destiny had assigned to them. Odin made his way toward Fenrir, cutting down giants and dead warriors who tried to stop him, his spear singing through the air as he fought with the skill that came from being the god of war and the father of battles. The wolf saw him coming and moved to meet him, stepping on friend and foe alike without distinction, crushing giants beneath his paws as he advanced toward the Allfather. They met in the center of the battlefield, god and wolf, father figure of the ordered cosmos and child of chaos, and for a moment they regarded each other,
Odin looking up at the enormous beast whose jaws gaped wide enough to swallow the sky, and Fenrir looking down at the god who had tricked him into bondage so many ages ago. Odin attacked first, hurling Gungnir at Fenrir's eye, the spear that never missed its target flying straight and true toward the wolf's face. But Fenrir moved with speed that belied his size, dodging aside so that the spear passed harmlessly by, and then the wolf lunged forward with his jaws open wide. Odin tried to dodge, tried to avoid those terrible teeth, but Fenrir was too fast and too large, and the wolf's jaws closed around the Allfather, swallowing him whole. In an instant, Odin was gone, consumed by the beast he had helped to bind, the god of wisdom and war devoured by chaos incarnate, his death fulfilling the prophecy that had been spoken before time began its counting. But Odin's death was not the end of his line, for even as Fenrir swallowed the Allfather, Vidar, one of Odin's sons, saw what had happened and rushed toward the wolf in rage and grief. Vidar was known as the Silent God, one who spoke little, but whose strength was second only to Thor's, and he wore a special shoe that had been made from all the scraps of leather that humans had cut away when making their own footwear, accumulating over centuries into a boot of tremendous strength. Vidar placed this boot against Fenrir's lower jaw and grabbed the wolf's upper jaw with his hands, and with all his mighty strength he began to tear the wolf's jaws apart. Fenrir struggled and thrashed, trying to bite down, trying to shake off this god who dared to assault him so directly. But Vidar was relentless, pulling with strength born of grief and rage, and slowly the wolf's jaws were forced wider and wider apart until finally they tore, splitting Fenrir's skull, killing the beast that had killed Odin, avenging the Allfather's death even as it was occurring. Across the battlefield, Thor had found his destined opponent, for Jormungandr had pulled his enormous body onto land and was making his way across the plain of Vigrid, crushing everything beneath his massive coils, leaving a trail of poisoned earth wherever his body touched the ground. The serpent and the god of thunder had met before in various encounters, testing themselves against each other, but those had been preliminaries, practice for this final confrontation. Now they met for the last time, and both knew that this battle would end with death for at least one of them, possibly for both. Thor raised Mjolnir, his hammer crackling with lightning, thunder rumbling through the dark sky despite the absence of clouds, and he brought the weapon down upon Jormungandr's skull with all his strength. The serpent's head was driven into the ground by the force of the blow, creating a crater where it struck, but Jormungandr was too large and too strong to be killed by a single strike, no matter how powerful. The world serpent reared back up, blood streaming from the wound Thor had inflicted, and opened his mouth to spray venom at the god who had struck him. Thor dodged aside, but some of the poison splattered across his armor, hissing where it touched metal, eating through the divine protection that had kept him safe through countless battles. Again and again Thor struck at Jormungandr with Mjolnir, each blow creating thunder that echoed across the dying world, each strike doing terrible damage to the serpent's enormous body. Jormungandr coiled around Thor, trying to crush him in his coils, trying to squeeze the life from the thunder god as he had squeezed the world in his embrace for so many ages. Thor struggled against the serpent's constricting body, breaking bones with his strength, tearing scales with his bare hands when he lost hold of his hammer, fighting with the fury that had made him the terror of giants throughout the ages. Finally, Thor managed to retrieve Mjolnir and delivered a blow directly to Jormungandr's head with such force that the serpent's skull shattered, brains and blood exploding from the impact, the world serpent's body going limp as death took him. Thor stood victorious over the serpent's corpse, breathing heavily, his armor corroded in places by the venom that had splashed upon him during the battle. But even in death,
Jormungandr achieved what the prophecy had said he would achieve, for the venom that covered Thor was working its way through the corrosion in his armor, seeping into his body, poisoning him from within. Thor managed to take 9 steps away from the serpent's body, 9 final steps, as the venom destroyed his internal organs, stopped his heart, killed him as surely as his hammer had killed Jormungandr. The thunder god collapsed, falling face down upon the poisoned earth, dead within moments of his greatest victory.
Freyr, the god of summer and fertility, found himself facing Surtur as the fire giant advanced across the battlefield with his flaming sword held high. The god of growth and abundance stood against the being whose purpose was to burn everything that existed, to return creation to the chaos of fire from which it had partially emerged. Freyr had given away his magical sword for love, and now he faced Surtur armed only with the antler of the stag, a weapon wholly inadequate for the fight he was about to undertake. But Freyr did not flee or beg for mercy, for he knew that some things were worth dying for, that the defense of what he loved justified facing impossible odds with insufficient weapons. Freyr attacked Surtur with the antler, striking at the fire giant with all his strength, but the antler shattered against Surtur's armor, breaking into fragments that fell uselessly to the ground. Surtur swung his flaming sword, and Freyr tried to dodge, but the blade caught him across the chest, cutting through divine flesh, burning what it cut, killing the god of summer with fire that represented the opposite of everything he had stood for in life. Freyr fell, his body consumed by flames, his essence scattered, the god of fertility and growth destroyed by the flames of destruction, his death another fulfillment of the prophecies that had been spoken before the world began. Tyr faced the hound Garmr, a beast almost as terrible as Fenrir, a monster that had been chained at the gates of Helheim to prevent the dead from escaping, but who had broken free when Ragnarok began, just as all the other bound beings had broken free. Garmr was red with the blood of those he had slain, his jaws dripping with gore, his eyes burning with mindless hunger for destruction. Tyr, who had lost his hand to Fenrir's jaws when the wolf was bound, fought the hound one-handed, wielding his sword with skill born of long practice at fighting with his remaining limb. The god and the hound circled each other, each looking for an opening, and then they rushed together in a fury of teeth and steel. They fought across the battlefield, god and beast, both dealing terrible wounds to the other, Tyr's sword cutting deep into Garmr's flesh, while the hound's teeth tore at the god's armor and the body beneath it. Finally, almost simultaneously, both landed killing blows, Tyr's sword piercing Garmr's heart, even as the hound's jaws closed around the god's throat, crushing it, severing arteries, bringing death to both combatants at the same moment. They fell together, god and beast, their blood mixing on the ground, both fulfilling the destiny that had been written for them in the threads of fate. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods who had sounded Gjallarhorn to announce the beginning of Ragnarok, found himself facing Loki, the trickster whose schemes had caused so much trouble for the gods over the ages. These two had been enemies for as long as anyone could remember, their opposition running deeper than any specific grudge or insult, representing something fundamental about the nature of order and chaos, vigilance and deception. They came together with weapons drawn, Heimdall with his sword that could cut through anything, Loki with a blade he had taken from one of the dead aboard Nagfar, and they began to fight with the accumulated fury of their ancient enmity. The battle between Heimdall and Loki ranged across the battlefield, both gods moving with speed and skill, each landing blows that would have killed lesser beings, but that they managed to survive through divine resilience. They fought with cunning as well as strength, Loki using tricks and feints, trying to deceive Heimdall as he had deceived so many others, while Heimdall used his superior senses to anticipate Loki's moves, seeing through deceptions that would have fooled anyone else. They were evenly matched, neither able to gain a decisive advantage, their combat becoming a dance of death that seemed as if it might go on forever. But all things must end, even fights between immortal beings. And finally, both Heimdall and Loki saw openings in each other's defenses simultaneously. They struck at the same instant, their swords piercing each other's hearts, driving deep into chests, bringing death to both of them as they had brought death to each other. They fell together, still gripping their swords, still embedded in each other's bodies. Their ancient enmity finally ended in mutual destruction, just as the prophecy had said it would end. Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out, as gods faced giants, as warriors fought the dead, as the forces of order and chaos engaged in their final confrontation. The fighting was terrible beyond description, the deaths uncountable, the destruction total. Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that had connected the realms, finally collapsed completely under the heat and weight of the fire giants who had crossed it, its shattered remnants falling into the void between worlds, severing the connection between Asgard and the other realms. The world tree Yggdrasil, which had stood at the center of all things since before creation began, trembled and shook as the battle raged around and beneath it, its roots damaged by the fighting, its trunk wounded by the weapons and magic being unleashed upon the field of Vigrid. Surtur, having killed Freyr and seeing that the gods were falling one by one, raised his flaming sword high and began to burn everything he could reach. The fire giant's blade set the earth itself aflame, the ground catching fire as if it were made of tinder rather than stone and soil. The flames spread rapidly, consuming the plain of Vigrid, spreading outward from the battlefield toward the rest of the world, burning with heat that was impossible to endure, with flames that could not be extinguished by any amount of water or any counter-magic. The trees of the world caught fire and burned like torches, their leaves and branches consumed in instants, their trunks following soon after. Forests that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to ash in moments. Fields of grain, ready for harvest that would never come, burned away to nothing. The flames reached Asgard itself, climbing the walls of the realm of the gods, consuming the magnificent halls that had stood there since the Golden Age began. Valhalla burned, its spear rafters and shield shingles catching fire, the hall of the slain destroyed by flames that cared nothing for glory or honor. Freya's hall, Sessrumnir, burned, and Thor's hall, Bilskirnir, burned, and all of the other halls of all of the other gods burned, their golden walls melting, their treasures destroyed, their beauty transformed into ash and smoke. Asgard, which had been the most splendid of all the realms, was reduced to a wasteland of fire, everything that the gods had built destroyed by Surtur's flames, just as the prophecy had said would happen. The fire spread to the other realms as well, for Yggdrasil itself was burning now, the world tree catching fire from root to crown, its ancient wood consumed by flames that ran up its trunk and along its branches, spreading the destruction to every realm that depended upon the tree for connection and support. Alfheim burned, the realm of the light elves, consumed by fire that cared nothing for their beauty or magic. Svartalfheim burned, the underground halls of the dwarves filling with smoke, their forges and workshops destroyed, the master craftsmen perishing along with their creations. Jotunheim burned, the realm of the giants destroyed along with everything else, for Surtur's fire made no distinction between friend and enemy, between order and chaos, consuming all things equally in its hunger for destruction. Midgard, which had already been devastated by Fimbulwinter and flooded by the tsunamis created by Jormungandr's movements, now burned as well, the few survivors who had managed to endure the great winter and the floods now perishing in flames they could not escape. The oceans themselves began to boil as the heat penetrated to their depths, steam rising in great clouds that added to the smoke already filling the sky, creating a darkness even deeper than the darkness that had fallen when the sun and moon were devoured. Everything burned, everything died, everything was destroyed,
until it seemed that the prophecy's description of the end was being fulfilled completely, that nothing would survive the flames and the violence, that all of creation would return to the void from which it had emerged. The sky itself seemed to be falling, the dome of heaven that the gods had made from Ymir's skull cracking and splitting, pieces of it tumbling down to crash upon the burning earth below.
The stars that had not already fallen now fell in showers, streaking across the dark sky like tears, winking out as they descended, their light extinguished forever. The air became poisonous, filled with smoke and venom, with ash and the smell of burning flesh, unbreathable, choking, deadly to any who tried to draw it into their lungs. The earth shook continuously now, not with individual earthquakes, but with a constant trembling that suggested the entire planet was coming apart, fragmenting under the assault of forces too powerful for matter to withstand. And then, as the flames reached their highest point, as the destruction seemed to be absolutely complete, the earth began to sink. The ground that remained after the burning and the shaking began to subside, dropping down as if something beneath it was giving way, and water rushed in to fill the spaces being created. The seas that had boiled under searchers' fires now flowed inward, covering the burning lands, extinguishing the flames, but also drowning everything, submerging what little remained after the fire had passed. Lower and lower the earth sank, and higher the waters rose, until the seas covered everything, until no land remained visible above the waves, until the entire world had been returned to a state resembling the primordial void from which it had emerged, nothing but water stretching in all directions without limit or end. The 9 realms were gone, collapsed or destroyed or submerged beneath the rising waters. Asgard had fallen, Midgard had drowned, Jotunheim had been consumed by fire and flood. Even Yggdrasil, the world tree that had held all the realms together, had been destroyed by the flames, its trunk consumed, its roots severed, its branches broken. Though some sources suggested that the tree somehow survived or would regrow from roots that had been protected deep beneath the earth. All that the gods had built, all that they had created from Ymir's body, all the order they had imposed upon chaos, had been undone, unmade, returned to nothingness. The gods were dead, fallen in battle against the forces of chaos they had struggled against since creation began. Odin had been devoured by Fenrir, Thor had been poisoned by Jormungandr, Freyr had been burned by Surtur's sword, Tyr had been slain by Garmr, Heimdall and Loki had killed each other. The great gods who had ruled over the cosmos were gone, their age ended, their time finished, their glory transformed into memory at best, and at worst simply erased from existence. The prophecy that had been spoken before the world began had been fulfilled completely. Ragnarok had occurred exactly as the Norns had said it would occur. The twilight of the gods had come and darkness had fallen over everything. The waters covered all things, dark and cold and still, no waves disturbing their surface, no wind blowing across their expanse. There was no light, for the sun and moon had been devoured, and the stars had fallen, and Asgard's halls with their golden glow had been destroyed. There was no sound, for all the beings who might have made sound were dead, and the earth itself had ceased its shaking, settling into stillness beneath the waters. There was no movement, no change, no time passing because there was nothing left to measure time, no one left to observe its passage. The universe had returned to a state resembling the void from which it had emerged, emptiness that stretched without limit, darkness that had no boundaries, silence that was absolute. And yet, some of the sources that tell this story say that this was not quite the end, that the destruction was not absolutely total, that from the waters a new world would emerge, green and beautiful, fertile and full of promise. These sources, recorded centuries after the Norse people had converted to Christianity, and filtered through the understanding of Christian scribes who may have altered the ending to make it more palatable to their new beliefs, describe a rebirth that followed the destruction, a renewal that gave hope where before there had been only doom. Whether this rebirth was part of the original Norse conception of Ragnarok, or whether it was a later addition meant to soften the harsh finality of the pagan ending, we cannot know with certainty. But let us tell the story of rebirth as it has been preserved, for even if it is a later addition, it speaks to something essential in the human spirit, the hope that even the most complete destruction can be followed by new creation. The waters that covered the earth began slowly to recede, draining away to some unknown place, revealing land beneath them that had not existed before, or perhaps was the same land transformed, washed clean by the flood that had covered it. This new land was green with vegetation that seemed to have sprung up spontaneously, grass covering fields, trees growing in groves and forests, flowers blooming in meadows. The earth was fertile beyond anything that had existed before Ragnarok, capable of producing abundant crops without cultivation, supporting life in ways that required no effort from those who would eventually inhabit it. The air was clean and pure, washed of all the poisons and smoke that had filled it during the destruction, sweet to breathe and gentle to the skin. The sky cleared, the darkness lifting to reveal a heavens that was blue and bright, though different from the sky that had existed before. A new sun rose in the east, and this sun was the daughter of the old sun that had been devoured by Skall, born somehow from her mother before the wolf had swallowed her, carrying on the task of lighting and warming the world. This new sun was perhaps brighter than the old one had been, or perhaps it only seemed brighter because of the darkness that had preceded it. But it rose each morning and set each evening, marking the return of time and seasons, the restoration of order to the universe. In this new world, in a place called Hodmir's Wood, where a forest had somehow survived the fires and floods of Ragnarok, or had regrown immediately after the destruction passed, two human beings emerged from hiding. These were Lif and Lifthrasir, whose names meant life and eager for life, a man and woman who had been hidden in the wood throughout Ragnarok, protected somehow from all the destruction that had killed the rest of humanity. Some sources suggest they had been nourished by the morning dew during their time in hiding, living on nothing but the moisture that collected on leaves during the night, sustained by this meager diet until it was safe to emerge. Lif of Lifthrasir looked out upon the new world and saw that it was good, that it was empty and waiting to be filled with life, that they had been spared to become the parents of a new human race, just as Ask and Embla had been the parents of the old human race. They left the wood and began to explore the new earth, finding it abundant and welcoming, capable of supporting them and the children they would have, the descendants who would spread across this renewed world and rebuild human civilization. These new humans would remember the old stories, would tell tales of the gods and their deeds, would preserve the memory of what had come before, even as they built something new. And the gods, too, had survivors, though not the great gods who had ruled during the Golden Age. Vidar, who had avenged his father Odin by killing Fenrir, had survived the destruction, protected perhaps by the special shoe he wore, or perhaps by some quality that made him suited to live on into the new age. Vali, another son of Odin, had also survived, and these two would become the foundation of a new generation of gods in the world that rose from the waters. Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor, had survived as well, and they had found their father's hammer, Mjolnir, recovered from where it had fallen when Thor died from Jormungandr's poison. These young gods carried Mjolnir with them into the new world, bearing both the weapon and the legacy of the thunder god who had wielded it. Most remarkably, Baldur returned from Helheim, released from the realm of the dead now that Ragnarok had passed, his beautiful face shining once again, his presence bringing light and joy back to existence. With him came Hoth, his blind brother who had killed him with the mistletoe guided by Loki's hand. And in the new world after Ragnarok, the two brothers were reconciled, the old tragedy forgiven, or at least set aside in favor of new possibilities. Some sources mention other gods who survived or returned, suggesting that the divine world was not entirely destroyed but rather transformed, reduced to a smaller group who would oversee a simpler, perhaps better world than the one that had been destroyed. These surviving gods gathered in the place where Asgard had stood, finding in the grass golden playing pieces that had belonged to the gods of the old world, chess pieces or gaming tokens that had somehow survived the destruction. The gods sat in the grass and played with these pieces, remembering the old world, telling stories about Odin and Thor and all the others who had fallen during Ragnarok, preserving the memory of what had been while beginning to build what would be. They spoke of the events that had led to the destruction, of Baldur's death and Loki's punishment, of the binding of Fenrir and the growing darkness, learning from the mistakes that had been made, perhaps hoping to avoid repeating them in this new age. Over all of this, according to some sources, there ruled a new supreme being, a power greater than Odin had been, referred to sometimes as the Mighty One or the Powerful One, a deity who would govern the new world with wisdom and justice. Some scholars believe this figure was influenced by Christian ideas about God, added to the Norse myth after conversion to make the ending more consistent with Christian theology. Others argue that this supreme deity was always part of the Norse conception, a power that existed beyond and above even the gods, a force that continued even after Ragnarok had destroyed the old order. Whether this being was original to the myth or a later addition, it represents the idea that even after the end of all things, there is something that continues, that existence itself cannot be completely destroyed, that from even the most total annihilation, there can come renewal and hope. The story of Ragnarok, this tale of doom and destruction followed by renewal and rebirth, meant many things to the Norse people who preserved it and told it to their children through countless generations. On one level, it was a prophecy about the future, a description of how the world would end when the time came for endings, a vision of the ultimate fate of gods and humans and everything in between. The Norse people believed that this ending was written into the fabric of reality, that destiny was real and inescapable, that even the gods could not avoid the fate that had been woven for them by the Norns. This belief in inescapable fate gave the myth a tragic quality, a sense of doom that hung over even the most glorious moments of the Golden Age, for everyone knew that glory would eventually fade and darkness would come. But the myth was more than just a prophecy. It was also a statement about how to live in the face of inevitable doom, about what values mattered when you knew that everything would eventually be destroyed.
The gods of Norse mythology were not immortal in the way that the gods of some other mythologies were immortal. They aged and could be killed. They feared death and struggled against it. But they also accepted that death would come eventually, and they chose to face it with courage rather than trying to avoid it through cowardice. When Odin learned that Fenrir would devour him, he did not try to hide or flee, but instead prepared for the battle, gathering warriors and making plans, accepting his doom, but refusing to let that acceptance turn into passivity or despair. This attitude toward fate and death reflected the values of the Viking culture that created and preserved these myths. The Vikings lived dangerous lives, sailing treacherous seas, raiding foreign shores, fighting in battles where death was always a present possibility. They valued courage in the face of danger, honor in the face of death, and they believed that how you faced your end mattered more than the fact that the end was coming. A brave death in battle was preferable to a cowardly life hiding from danger, and the gods who faced Ragnarok with weapons in hand, fighting to the last, despite knowing they would lose, embodied this ideal perfectly. The myth of Ragnarok taught that doom was inevitable, but cowardice was not, that defeat was certain, but disgrace was not, that death would come, but how you met it was your choice. The cyclical nature of the myth, with destruction followed by rebirth, reflected Norse understanding of the natural world and the passage of time.
The Norse people lived close to nature and observed its cycles, seeing how winter killed plants that would grow again in spring, how forests burned and then regrew, how the sun was weaker in winter but gained strength again in summer. They understood that destruction was not the opposite of creation, but rather its necessary precursor, that things had to die for new things to be born, that endings enabled beginnings. Ragnarok represented this principle on a cosmic scale, showing that even the universe itself followed the pattern of death and rebirth that governed everything within it. The myth also served as a framework for understanding change and crisis in the Norse world. When traditional ways of life were threatened by invasion or conversion to Christianity, when the old gods seemed to be dying and new beliefs replacing them, the Norse people could understand these changes through the lens of Ragnarok, seeing them as part of a larger cycle that would eventually lead to renewal, even as it brought destruction to what had been before. The coming of Christianity could be understood as a kind of Ragnarok, the end of the age of the old gods, but also potentially the beginning of something new, a renewal that might follow destruction just as the myth described. In our modern world, separated by centuries from the Vikings who first told this story, Ragnarok continues to resonate because the themes it explores are universal and timeless. We too live with the knowledge that all things end, that civilizations rise and fall, that everything we build will eventually crumble. We too struggle with the question of how to live meaningfully in the face of this knowledge, how to maintain hope and courage when we understand that nothing lasts forever. The myth of Ragnarok offers one answer to these questions, suggesting that what matters is not whether we can prevent endings, but how we face them. Not whether we can avoid doom, but whether we meet it with dignity and courage. The environmental crisis facing our modern world, the threats of climate change and ecological collapse, give new relevance to a myth about the world being destroyed by fire and flood, about the consequences of actions taken long ago finally coming due, about the question of whether renewal can follow destruction, or whether some endings are too final to allow for rebirth. Ragnarok reminds us that actions have consequences that may not become apparent until long after those actions were taken, that binding the wolf does not make the wolf less dangerous, but only delays the day when it will break free, that ignoring threats does not make them disappear, but only ensures we will be less prepared when they finally arrive. The story of Ragnarok has influenced countless works of modern literature, art, music, and film, becoming one of the most recognizable myths from Norse culture, standing alongside tales of Thor's hammer and Odin's wisdom as defining stories of the Norse worldview. Writers and artists have returned to this myth again and again, finding in it themes that speak to their own times and concerns, adapting it to explore questions about fate and free will, about destruction and renewal, about the end of ages and the hope for what might come after. The myth has proven endlessly adaptable, capable of speaking to different ages and different concerns while maintaining its essential character as a story about the twilight of the gods and the possibility of dawn following darkness. And so, our journey through the story of Ragnarok comes to its end, though endings are always also beginnings, as the myth itself teaches us. We have traveled from the very beginning of time, from the void of Ginnungagap and the meeting of ice and fire, through the creation of the cosmos from Ymir's body, through the golden age of the gods and the gathering shadows that presaged its end. We have witnessed Baldur's death and Loki's punishment, have endured the 3 winters of Fimbulwinter, and watched as the wolves devoured sun and moon. We have stood upon the plain of Vigrid and watched gods and monsters clash in the final battle, have seen the world burn in Searcher's flames and sink beneath the rising waters. And we have seen the green earth rise again from the depths, have witnessed the emergence of Lif and Leifthrsir and the return of Baldur, have understood that even after the end of all things, existence continues, life persists, hope remains. As you drift now toward sleep, carried by these ancient visions of doom and renewal, of gods who knew they would die but fought anyway, of a world that ended but was reborn, let yourself find peace in the knowledge that the story continues. the cosmos that rises each morning with the sun, that turns with the seasons, that renews itself constantly through cycles of death and birth, partakes of the same eternal pattern that Ragnarok describes. Nothing lasts forever, but nothing is ever truly lost. For everything that ends makes space for something new to begin, and in that space between ending and beginning, in that moment of possibility, there exists all the potential of existence itself. Sleep now, and dream of green fields rising from dark waters, of a sun that is the daughter of the old sun, lighting a world that is both ancient and new, of gods who play with golden chess pieces in the grass while remembering the glories and learning from the mistakes of the age that came before. Dream of Yggdrasil, the world tree, growing again from roots that could not be destroyed, its branches reaching once more toward the heavens, its trunk serving again as the axis around which the cosmos turns. Dream of Lif and Lifthrasir, walking through forests that have never known axe or fire, discovering valleys where no human has ever walked, building the first settlement of the new world with hope in their hearts and stories of the old world on their lips. And if you have enjoyed this journey through the most dangerous myth ever told, through the complete story of Ragnarok from beginning to end and beyond, consider leaving a like on this video, subscribing to the channel for more explorations of ancient mythology and forgotten lore, and sharing this tale with others who might find peace in these old stories told new. The ancient Norse would have shared these tales around fires on long winter nights, passing them from generation to generation through the sound of human voices. And in watching and sharing these videos, you participate in that same ancient tradition of storytelling, keeping alive myths that have survived for centuries and deserve to survive for centuries more. Sleep well, dream deeply, and may you wake to a world that is green and beautiful, renewed and full of possibility, just as the world rose from the waters after Ragnarok had passed. The story is complete, the telling is finished, and now there is only silence and peace and the gentle drift towards sleep that comes at the end of all tales well told. Good night.